All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to MassMEDIC's Regulatory Roundup. We have an amazing program for you today, so we're so glad that you joined us. I do want to take a moment and just thank our sponsors who make this program possible: Viva MedTech, Alira Health, Dwayne Morris, and Intertech. If you haven't had a chance to come to a MassMEDIC program before, my name is Nicole Owens. I'm the Director of Marketing Communications. And if you're not familiar with our organization, we are a regional membership trade association for the medical device industry to help bolster the industry in New England primarily through education, events like this, connection, advocacy, and awareness. We have, like I said, a wonderful program for you today. You are going to have ample time to ask questions. So I do encourage you to put your questions when you have them at any time in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to them as appropriate and as time permits. Everyone who registered for this webinar will also receive a recording following the webinar and most of the slides as well. So there's going to be tons of resources coming out of this webinar. So with that, without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to our first speaker, who has some really timely and exciting news for our industry. So Sandra Reichenbacher-Lauschi is the head of public affairs and legal counsel. She's also the member of the executive board for MassMEDIC. She today is going to talk about the impact of a recent decision of the Swiss Parliament on medical device with FDA authorization. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sandra. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning, Nicole. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you for the invitation to speak at today's webinar. It's a pleasure to speak today to you representing MassMEDIC, the Swiss Medical Technology Association. MassMEDIC represents more than 750 companies, ranging from a number of global players to many small and middle-sized enterprises. MassMEDIC is based in Bern, the capital of Switzerland. I will divide my presentation into two parts. In the first part, I will provide you with a brief introduction to Switzerland, the Swiss medical technology sector, the supply of medical devices in Switzerland, and I will also provide you with a brief excursus on the relationship between Switzerland and the European Union. And in a second part, I will then come to the main topic of this session, namely the recent decision of the Swiss Parliament concerning medical devices of non-European regulation systems and FDA authorized medical devices in particular. Switzerland and the United States are often referred to as sister republics. The United States and Switzerland enjoy a long-standing friendship and close economic ties. There are lots of similarities, but also differences. And now I'm going to share my presentation. Can you see it? Okay. Switzerland is, with regard to its surface, a small country in the heart of Europe, with a population which is growing in the direction of 9 million inhabitants. Switzerland is a high-tech location. There are several leading universities, technical institutes, and research institutions, as it is in the US. According to the Global Index 2022 of the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO, Switzerland is the worldwide most innovative country, closely followed by the US in the second place. The medical technology industry is economically significant in Switzerland. And it is a sector which continues to grow, thanks to the great commitment and high agility of our member companies. With around 67,500 employees, the sector generated industry-wide revenue of 20.8 billion Swiss francs in 2021. The figures in this presentation will all be in Swiss francs. So if you want to have the figures in US dollars, you have to add 10%. So in US dollars, it is 10% plus. In 2021, the MedTech sector generated exports of 11.9 billion Swiss francs and a trade surplus of 5.9 billion Swiss francs. These are quite impressive figures considering the size of Switzerland. As I said, in 2021, Switzerland exported medical devices in the amount of 11.9 billion Swiss francs and imported medical devices in the amount of 6 billion Swiss francs. The US and our neighboring country, Germany, are Switzerland's most important trading partners with regard to medical devices. It follows from this slide that if you add the export and import figures of the individual EU member states, then the European Union is Switzerland's most important trading partner in the area of medical devices, followed by the US, China, and Japan. Around half by volume of Swiss MedTech exports go to the EU. Almost 60% by volume of our MedTech imports come from the European Union. With regard to the import side, there are two important points to highlight. Because of the diversity and large number of needed medical devices, Switzerland, like many other countries, is not in the position to produce all the needed medical devices itself. And needed are around 500,000 different medical devices. So this means Switzerland depends on imports to a large extent. And the second point to emphasize, in Switzerland, in the current situation, only medical devices which do have a CE mark, meaning which do correspond to the EU Medical Device Regulation MDR, are allowed to be imported. This requirement applies to medical devices originating from around the globe. So this means, going back to the previous slide, the imports coming from the US, China, or Japan are all products with a CE mark. In the sense of a short excursus, I would also like to give you some background information on Switzerland's relation with the European Union. Switzerland is not a member of the European Union. However, Switzerland is linked to the EU through a series of bilateral agreements. Of particular importance for the MedTech sector is the Mutual Recognition Agreement, MRA, which entered into force in 2022. It ensures, or more precisely, I have to say, it ensured barrier-free access to the EU internal market for medical devices. The barrier-free access to the EU internal market in the area of medical devices unfortunately no longer exists today. In May 2021, the European Union declared the MRA no longer applicable for medical devices. Why? Switzerland and the EU were negotiating an institutional framework agreement that was to regulate the general institutional framework between Switzerland and the European Union. On the 26th of May 2021, the Swiss government broke off the negotiations unilaterally. The European Union reacted, as mentioned, by declaring the MRA no longer applicable. This situation is a loss for the EU and Switzerland because there are now hurdles for the export and for the import side. and this has an impact on the availability of medical devices in Switzerland. I'm now coming to the main part of our session, the recent decision of the Swiss Parliament regarding medical devices from non-European regulation system, in particular FDA authorized products. And I will speak about the aforementioned points on this slide. The decision of the Parliament, the background of the motion, which is at the origin of the decision of the Swiss Parliament, the implementation of this motion, and then also conclude by elaborating on crucial success factors for the implementation of the motion. So, what is the content of the decision of the Swiss Parliament of 28th of November 2022? The Swiss Parliament instructed the Swiss government, based on the mentioned motion 20.3211, to adapt the national legal basis so that in future, in addition to medical devices that comply with the European MDR, medical devices of non-European regulations will also be permitted in Switzerland. The discussions in the Swiss Parliament focused on FDA authorized medical devices. The origin of this mandate is this motion 20.3211 with the title "For more room for maneuver in the procurement of medical devices to supply the Swiss population," submitted by Damian Müller, member of the Council of States. And every motion has a number, as I just mentioned, the number of this motion being 20.3211. This slide shows how we from MassMEDIC envisage the situation to be after the revision of the national legal basis. There will be medical devices with CE marks and FDA authorized products accepted in Switzerland. Then there is the possibility that in the future, also medical devices from further regulatory systems will be accepted. The decision of the Swiss Parliament is considered to be pioneering. Why? Because medical devices with FDA authorization are not permitted in the EU. Switzerland therefore plays a pioneering role in Europe, and in this context also to note, interestingly, the United Kingdom, no longer a member of the European Union since the beginning of 2020, is reportedly working on a similar regulation. So everything started with the mentioned motion submitted by the member of Council of State, Damian Müller, on May 2020. A motion is a parliamentary request or instrument which can be submitted by a member of parliament. Its main objective is to mandate the Swiss government to amend a national law in a specific sense. In order to become binding, a motion has to undergo a parliamentary process. Swiss Parliament has, like the US Parliament, two chambers, which are the Council of States and the National Council. A motion has to be adopted by both councils, first in the council where it was submitted. So the motion in question was adopted last year by both chambers of the Swiss Parliament, by both councils. The Swiss government was therefore given the mandate to adapt the national legal basis on the 28th of November 2022. The federal administration is now responsible for the implementation of this mandate, meaning for starting the process to revise the national legal basis so that in the future, also medical devices from non-European regulation systems will be accepted in Switzerland. In principle, the Swiss government has now 2 years to implement the mandate. Swiss MedTech will try to actively bring its positions and the expectations of the MedTech industry into this implementation process. Such important revisions can only be made in close cooperation with the stakeholders concerned. So at this point, it is essential to note FDA authorized medical devices are today still not permitted in Switzerland. The mandate from the Swiss Parliament to the Swiss government has just been given and must now be implemented. This means that the national basis must first be revised, and this takes time. The lead in this lies with the Federal Ministry of Home Affairs. Only then, when these legal adjustments will come into force, FDA authorized medical devices will be recognized in Switzerland. Switzerland does not want to move away from CE marked products. For CE marked medical devices, nothing will change. It is about the parallel recognition of medical devices of non-European regulatory systems. Once the revision of the legal basis will come into force, it will not be possible to re-export FDA-approved medical devices from Switzerland to the European Union, because the European Union does not allow FDA-authorized products on its territory. Now, why are FDA products important for Switzerland? This slide will provide you with an overview on the main 3 reasons. The details for each point will follow in the coming slides. FDA products are important for Switzerland. First, to guarantee the sufficient supply of medical devices to the Swiss population. This is today not guaranteed. To ensure that the Swiss population has access to the newest medical products. This is also not the case today. And to strengthen the innovative power and competitiveness of the Swiss medical technology industry. I'm now coming to the reasons behind these 3 points. To point 1, why is the sufficient supply of medical devices not guaranteed in the actual situation? Because MDR makes medical devices disappear from the market in Europe. The MDR over-bureaucratization leads to cost increases for medtech companies and to a thinning out of the product portfolio in Europe. A survey by MedTech Europe shows that more than 50% of the companies throughout Europe are reducing their product portfolio by 1/3 because of the MDR. Around 15% of the existing medical devices in Europe will disappear because transition from the old to the new regulation is not profitable. This streamlining of portfolio is already ongoing. Then niche products, even established ones, often do not generate sufficient clinical data for transfer to MDR. These products will be unavailable in Europe. Moreover, specifically for Switzerland, an additional 15% of medical products imported today are already missing because the import hurdles are too high. Point 2, the recognition of FDA-approved medical devices is important in order to ensure the access to the newest products. 50% of companies surveyed across Europe prioritize the FDA for the initial approval of their medical devices, and the trend is on rise. These medical products do not come to Europe or Switzerland at all, or at best with a delay of years. The reasons given are, on the one hand, the challenges in connection with MDR, and on the other hand, FDA's progressiveness regarding digitalization. Also, Swiss companies often choose to go to the US for the first market approval of their products. This leads us to the untenable situation that products are developed in Switzerland, but Swiss patients cannot profit from them. And this situation must be changed. 2.3, MDR weakens innovative power of the Swiss medtech industry. MDR creates a backlog of innovation, tying up resources otherwise needed for innovation. As a consequence, there is less R&D carried out. FDA, on the other hand, is keeping pace with the digitalization. For digital technologies, such as artificial intelligence, progressive regulation is crucial. Diversification of regulatory systems is important for medtech companies, so it is important that they have the possibility to choose the regulation which fits best their needs. It is important for Swiss medtech companies to maintain the innovative power and competitiveness of the Swiss medtech industry. And if we lose more and more research and development, then we will also lose many bright minds, as well as production and value creation in Switzerland. Before we will come to the Q&A session, I would like to mention some crucial success factors for the implementation of the parliamentary mandate. It is urgent. The implementation must be initiated quickly in view of the effects of the MDR on patient care and on Switzerland as location of innovation. A comprehensive approach is important. In principle, all medical devices with FDA authorization should be recognized, both existing and new medical devices. The implementation must be based on a modular approach. The implementation should be future-oriented. It should be possible to include the option to recognize medical devices from other regulatory systems in the future. But clearly, as a first step, the legal basis for medical devices with FDA authorization should be created. Practical and workable. The parties concerned must be able to rely on a clear and understandable basis. And last but not least, the recognition of medical devices with FDA authorization should be as lean as possible.
All right, thank you, Sandra. Now
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole. Bye-bye.
Hi. Now we're going to turn the presentation over to our next set of speakers from Alira Health. We're going to continue the conversation on European regulation with MDR. The presentation is MDR today and tomorrow, and I'm pleased to introduce Anoa Forteza and Marcia Guerra. Anoa is the excuse me, Associate Director of Regulatory Affairs, and Marcia, the Manager of Regulatory Affairs. And they're going to do a presentation on MDR. Again, we are going to take questions, so please feel free to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Anoa. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicole, for the introduction. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay. Perfect. So hello all, and thanks a lot for being here, and welcome to this presentation where we will provide you, as Nicole was saying, an overview of the current status of MDR. My name is Ainhoa Forteza. I am a human biologist by training. I've been working for regulatory affairs consulting for almost a decade, and I am leading the MedTech Regulatory Affairs department at Alira Health. Merce?
Yes, so thank you all for being here. My name is Merce Guerra, and I'm also a human biologist by training like Ainhoa, and I've been working on consultancy for the last 5 years. And now together with Ainhoa, we both work at Alira Health, providing regulatory advice to devices and also IVDs covering both Europe and the US markets. Thank you, Ainhoa. So I will continue with the presentation. Yeah, thank you. This first slide, as I was saying, the objective of today's presentation is to give you an update on which is the current state of the regulatory framework for devices here in Europe. So this first slide basically summarizes which is the regulatory framework in Europe. Maybe you have already heard about it, but we think that it is good to refresh it, because at the end, it will be helpful to understand the latest changes that have taken place in the last month here in Europe. So, as you know, the European legislation for medical devices was first introduced in the 90s, so some time ago. And it was covered by 3 different legislative texts, which were the so-called directive. So we have the directive for in vitro diagnostic devices, the IVDD. Then we have the directive for medical devices, the so-called MDD. And then there was another directive, which is the AMEDI for the activable implantable medical devices. So the fact is that all these 3 legislative texts are very old texts, and they do not gather the current state of the art of medical devices, neither in terms of technological advances or the state of the art in terms of safety and performance. And maybe I can give you an example that helps you understand why these texts were not reflecting, the technology itself. For instance, those texts did not include the definition of a software as a medical device, and probably you know that currently there are more devices like they are software-based products. So this is just an example. So what happened is that the European Commission some years ago proposed to update the regulatory framework and create new legal texts. So in 2012, there were two new legal texts proposed, which were the regulations. So the medical device regulation was drafted for the medical devices, and the in vitro diagnostic regulation was drafted for the in vitro diagnostic products. After several years, these 2 legislative texts became into force. In fact, May last year, it was the year that the medical device regulation became fully applicable. Although initially it was planned to be fully applicable in 2020, there was 1 year delay already due to the COVID pandemic. And it was May last year, 2022, when the IVDR, the other legal text, became fully applicable. So what does it mean? It means that right now, the only text that applies in Europe are both the MDR and the IVDR. The truth, however, is that there is a transition period set, and there was a transition period set up where there was a coexistence of the 2 regulatory texts. But as I was saying, now the 2 texts are fully applicable. Okay. So this is more or less the summary of this slide, which, as I was saying, I think it is good to remind which is the regulatory framework in Europe. Next slide, Dana, please. Perfect. So during these years of the coexistence between the two legal texts, and then yes, sorry, yeah, exactly. Then these two legal texts that have been fully applicable right now, what has been, I mean, all the companies have seen that they face some difficulties when they were trying to implement these regulatory requirements. Then, in addition to that, what has happened in Europe, and maybe you are aware of it, is that the legal entities in charge of certifying the products, the so-called notified bodies, should be redesignated under the MDR. In other words, they should demonstrate that they have the capacities to emit the CE mark, the certificates under this new regulatory framework. And the current situation is that there are less notified bodies in Europe than there used to be under the previous legal text. So this is something that is affecting the timelines to receive the CE mark. It is also affecting the chances of you being accepted by a notified body to review your product on time. So we have these two aspects, the difficulties on the manufacturers to implement the changes, also the difficulties of notified bodies to accept and review the certificates on time. Plus, we have to also consider that, as I was saying before, there has been a transition period with the coexistence of the two legal texts, and also manufacturers that have already a product on the market were allowed to maintain these all certificates until 2024. But the thing is that by 2024, they should recertificate and receive the new certificate. So there was like an expected clash because their notified bodies could not recertify all the certificates on time. So all this situation has led to a situation, like, how to say, a difficult situation, if not chaotic, in Europe, where many manufacturers and the authorities were facing challenges to implement all the MDR requirements. So I know if you can go to the next slide. Yeah. So what is, in the last months, and probably you've heard about, is that based on the situation that I was explaining before, all the difficulties that the manufacturers and authorities have been facing, the European Commission, as well as many other stakeholders, have realized that without any legislative action, there was a significant risk that there was a disruption in the supply of serious medical devices. Again, as I was saying before, because it was very difficult to implement the changes because there was no time to receive the renewal of the certificates. So this is why in the recent months, and I know I will later explain elaborate on that, changes have been introduced in the legal framework in Europe in order to address these challenges. But before we move on, I think that we have prepared two polls for the attendees, and I think it will be a good idea if we launch these two polls now. It is basically to understand which is the MDR compliance status of our attendees, and also to understand if you are aware of these recent changes that have happened right now in Europe. So, Nicole, if you agree, maybe you can, yeah, perfect, thank you. We have two questions, as I was saying. The first one is, how is your MDR compliance status? And as you can see here, we have several options to answer. Maybe you have already your product MDR certified, which is really good, in fact, or maybe you are transitioning to the directive, or maybe you are a new, you are developing a new product and you directly apply MDR. So basically, we just wanted to ask you which is your status in terms of MDR compliance. So if you want, we can give you 1 minute to answer, and then we can share the results. Okay, let's see. That's interesting. I think that, I mean, most of the people is transitioning from the directive to the regulation, which indeed, I think this reflects the data that we have coming from the different European stakeholders, meaning that most of the, most of the industry already had probably a device under the directive, and now it's transitioning to the regulation. But I think it's really interesting that 13% of our attendees is already MDR certified, which I think it's quite a good percentage. So this is really interesting. And maybe we can show the question, the poll number 2, Nicole, if you can. Perfect, thank you. So yeah, as I was saying, there's been a lot of changes recently in Europe, and we just wanted to ask our attendees if you are aware of the new transition timelines that have been proposed by the European Commission. So the answer are yes, I know them, and I already took them into account, and we are implementing them. The other one is yet, but we have not carefully analyzed it. And the last one is, I have no idea, I've not heard about that. Okay, so here we have the results. Interesting also. So we have a 48% of our attendees who has said that yes, they've heard about it and they have already taken it into account. So good. You will probably know what I will explain now. Then we have 40% of the people who have heard it but not carefully analyzed it yet. So I know we will provide some recommendations on that regard. And finally, a 12% interesting also that has not heard about it. So this presentation will be really helpful for them. So thank you, Nicole, for sharing these polls. And now I know we'll continue with the presentation.
Thanks, Marcel. Thank you. So just to try to add a little bit of context of the timelines that we will present right now, I think it's important to mention first some figures, right? So the notified bodies reported in October last year that they had received approximately 8,000 applications from manufacturers requesting certification under the MDR. But that in contrast, they were able only to issue approximately 2,000 certificates. So that's an interesting number. So the estimation of the number of certificates that may be emitted by notified bodies around May 2024, when it's the end of the transition period, it's around 7,000 if the rate of certificate issuance is more or less the same as now. And that, without understanding further, that may seem a reasonable number, but we need to take into account that the devices that will need a renewal of the certificates by 2024 is approximately 21,000. So that's the number of certificates that will expire between January 2023 and May 2024. And the estimation only for the first 5 months of 2024 is of around 17,000. So we have a clear mismatch, right, between the capabilities of the notified bodies and the number of certificates that will need to be renewed according to the MDR. So this proposal will extend the current transition period of the MDR as per Article 120, based, of course, on certain conditions, so that only devices that are safe and for which manufacturers have already taken steps into the transition will benefit from this additional time. So this would give manufacturers and notified bodies precisely more time to conduct the conformity assessment procedures according to the MDR, and as long as these conditions are fulfilled. The proposal has been voted on the Parliament. We think it has been today, and it will be considered 100% official when it appears in the official journal, which, there is no specific timeline for that, but based on the previous amendment as well, it may take from 1 week to 2 weeks, more or less. But again, there is no official timeline. So if we take a look at the slide and maybe we analyze how do the new transition timelines look, you can see that for class 3 and class 2B implantable products, we will have until December 2027 to comply with the MDR. And for class 2B non-implantable, for certain type of other class 2B devices, for class 2A, and for class 1 devices requiring a certificate, manufacturers will have until December 2028. Again, it's important to mention that the following cumulative conditions that we will present in the next slide will need to happen for the extended transition period to apply. So let's take a look at those conditions and see if, what will need to happen in order for a manufacturer to be able to benefit from these extensions. The first thing is that the devices will need to continue to comply with the directives as they were certified in the past as applicable, and that the devices do not undergo any significant change in the design and the intended purpose, otherwise that would trigger the renewal of the certificate, and in that case, we would need to apply MDR anyway. That the devices do not present an unacceptable risk to the health and safety of the patients. And one important, or two, let's say, important provisions is that by 26 May 2024, in order for the manufacturers to benefit from these transition timelines, the manufacturers will have to demonstrate that they are well on the way to apply MDR. And one way of doing that is making sure that manufacturers have implemented a quality management system. So that will be one condition in order to benefit from the extension. Another important condition is that manufacturers also must have an agreement in place with the notified body by this date, so May 2024. So while this new proposal grants further time to prepare, it is not without its own requirements and provisions. Another important thing to mention is that the sell-off period that was introduced in the MDR and IVDR, important as well, will be cancelled. So in this case, what the European Commission is trying to achieve with this action is that it will prevent unnecessary disposal of safe medical devices that are already on the market, but not yet with the final user. So as a summary, the expired certificates could be reactivated again with specific requirements for manufacturers to prove that they are on the way to comply with MDR, and being the most important provisions, the application of the quality management system and the contract in place with the notified body, both by May 2024. Okay. So apart from these new transition periods, what else can we expect, right, in 2023 that is applicable to MDR, but not only to MDR, right? So to add some context, in 2022, both manufacturers and regulatory consultants as well that we work with devices, we were overwhelmed, right, a little bit with the new guidance from the regulatory working groups, especially the medical device coordination group that issued around 30 guidance documents in 2022. So for this year, for 2023, we cannot think about even more guidance. So not only for the MDR, but also for the IVDR and for a lot of different products and procedures. So this will be, an important topic for 2023 as well. And, the guidelines, it's true that they complement the legal text. They provide some clarifications on the requirements, And it's true that sometimes they may even raise more questions. So one of the requirements that should be in place as well is be able to have a system in place and be able to track all the guidance that is issued and understand how it impacts the sponsor's devices. Another source of stress for 2022, in 2022 for manufacturers was as well the situation with Switzerland and UK. We will not provide a lot of details on this, and more particularly on Switzerland because of the previous presentation. Of course, now both they have their own new regulatory frameworks. The UK has been forced to extend the transition period for manufacturers. So for now, the European certificates are accepted. And for Switzerland, we will continue to see, as Sandra was explaining in the previous presentation, which new information is provided during the next months, especially during the whole year. Apart from that, the fact that EUDAMED is not fully functional yet is introducing as well another layer of difficulty. So we will see as well which news we'll have in 2023 on this regard. So just to finalize, to provide a little bit of wrap up of everything we've been discussing, our advice to manufacturers is that you should prepare to demonstrate that you are on the way to comply with MDR in order to be able to benefit from the extension, right? The first step is to read and understand the legal text of the proposal, how it affects your devices, and how you can comply with the extension deadlines. After that, it will be important to carry out a gap analysis to identify which requirements have not been implemented yet, and be able to define a plan to be able to close those gaps and move forward with the application of the MDR. And in case you have multiple devices, it's important to understand the prioritization, right? So making sure that you can transversally apply and correct and solve those gaps, but in some cases, it will be important to prioritize. So if you are still not up to date with MDR implementation, the most important advice would be to start as soon as possible. As you've been able to see, the extension of the transition period will only happen if these particular conditions that we were explaining applies. So in case, let's imagine that you are planning this renewal of the certificate, or even if you are applying the MDR from scratch, once you are on good track for MDR implementation, the advice would be to contact the notified bodies as soon as possible, either yours, if you already have a certificate, or new one if you are applying the MDR from scratch, for making sure that there will be a contract in place by 2024. So here's the end of the presentation, and we'll be happy to take questions for the next 10 minutes.
So yeah, thank you very much. I know we have some questions here. Let them start asking them. So the first one that I see is, have these European new timelines affected the US device market?
Okay, so not directly, in the sense that the FDA continues to have its own timeline, so as always. But the way it has affected is that, you know, in the past we had like an opposite situation, right? So manufacturers tend to enter first the European market. Maybe it was like less stringent market, and then moving to the US, where they knew that the FDA will be much more, you know, strict on how to apply. So now we are seeing a switch in the situation. So it's not like these timelines are affecting directly FDA. It's that manufacturers are thinking on entering first the US market because of the less chaotic situation. at least there's an understanding of the timelines, on how the FDA proceeds, on which interactions you can have with the FDA, on how to prepare your documentation, right? Whereas on the European side, if we are talking about a manufacturer that it's maybe implementing the MDR from scratch or IVDR from scratch, that may create a feeling of uncertainty or a feeling of chaos that may make them think to enter the US market first.
Perfect, Dina. So there are more questions. The next one is related to equivalence, in fact, so I will ask, okay. The question is, can you speak to the challenges and any tips in demonstrating clinical evidence equivalency with literature research as a Class 2B device?
Okay, yeah, this is an interesting question because, you know, the equivalency requirements under MDR are much more strict, right? So you need to demonstrate the technical similarity, the biological similarity, and the clinical similarity. So basically, we think that the way the MDR is introducing this, it's basically reflecting that you can use your own data from previous versions of a device, right? In other words, trying to justify equivalency with a product that it's not your own will usually imply that you will need to have full access to that information, or that there is a contract in place with that company, which if it's your competitor will usually not happen. So you will need to justify that the device is almost the same, like from a technical, biological, and clinical perspective, it's almost the same. And again, you will need to have access to full documentation, which in this case does not usually happen because it will imply maybe, you know, having a contract with that company. I don't know if that replies to your question.
Yeah, I think it's a good reply. And if I can add something here, something that we really recommend is that maybe you have a system in place that has allowed you to collect real world data while your product was in the market, if this is the case. So, I mean, at the end, the challenge here is that if your product was previously based on equivalence with another product, maybe you have to generate a lot of new clinical data, right? So it is, we always advise to review which clinical data you have generated, if you have real world evidence data, to at the end determine if you should generate new data to comply with the MDR, which is usually the challenge that we face with our clients, that then maybe they need to generate a lot of clinical data because they cannot claim equivalence as before. Yeah. So next question, I know. Yeah. The next question is, when do you expect to hear the outcome of the parliament vote occurring this month? I assume these proposed extensions are valid until it passes the vote.
Are valid or are not valid?
Are valid.
So, okay,
Yeah.
okay. So again, the parliament vote has occurred today, as I said during the presentation. So it's almost official, but you know, legally it is not 100% official until it has been published on the official journal. And that could happen in the next weeks. I mean, again, I think I said that during the presentation, there is no official timeline for now, the publishing in the official journal. But if we take a look at what happened in 2020 in COVID for the extension of the MDR from 2020 to 2021, it was published in 1 week. So maybe, I don't know, from 1 week, 2 weeks, but again, it's just a guess based on what we saw in the past. But we will need to wait for the proposal to be officially published in the official journal, but it's almost, I mean, almost official.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. So the next question, yeah, in the last slide, you mentioned to gap analyze MDR requirements. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Sure. So if you're transitioning from the directive to the regulation, you will need to understand which are the difference, right, between the two regulatory frameworks. So it is not the same requirements, right, under MDD than under MDR. So you will need to understand which are the gaps, and that's where the word gap analysis means, right? So you need to understand which are the gaps, which are the differences between both settings, and you will need to compare all the applicable testing that you've done under MDD to see if you need to execute anything else under MDR to fulfill the more stricter requirements. But not only that, so you will need to understand if there has been any new ISO version published, and understand if that implies executing any new testing or providing any additional information. And you know, from all the points of view, so from the point of view of specifically the device having to execute more trials, more testing, or from the regulatory perspective of all the potential regulatory pieces that were not requested in the previous medical devices directive framework, right? Like the post-market surveillance, the post-market clinical follow-up, like all these kind of figures that were not in place. Again, I think it's important to remember that there are some provisions. So even if you are benefiting of the transitional period, and even now for more time, because you can take advantage of this new extended period, there are some requirements that need to be in place since May 2021, when the MDR became fully applicable. As an example, the post-market surveillance, vigilance, etc. So it's important to carefully analyze which are the requirements under the MDR and compare it to the MDD to be able to detect the gaps, prioritize them, and set up a plan to solve them. That's what gap analysis means.
Yeah, thank you, Ino, for the clarification. The next question is, do any notified body has an office in the US?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there are offices of the notified bodies, you know, around the globe, let's say. It's true that sometimes it's difficult to find an office that has, you know, like the responsibility or the actual ability to be able to emit certificates, no? So yeah, there are offices in the US, but sometimes you need to be careful asking the notified bodies which are the competences, no, in that sense. So if they are able to have auditors that are able to evaluate your information, that will be one point. But you know, the entities as such legally requiring the emission of the certificates are based in Europe, in the sense that the notified bodies are as such designated by the competent authorities, no? So the notified bodies are like delegated, are the entities in which the competent authorities delegates the responsibility of the emission of the certificates instead of doing that themselves, right? That's why for drugs or for medicinal products, we have, for example, the EMA, no, like an authority, public authority, depending on that. And we have the national agencies in each of the countries that can provide as well the approval of the drug products in all the different member states, right? But it will be important that, yeah, in the sense of the medical devices, it's not exactly like that. So it's not the national authorities of each member state, but the designated bodies, which are the notified bodies. And in this case, these are usually entities legally based in Europe with all the functionalities.
Yeah, I think that answers the question. There are more questions here. Let me see which is the next one. Yeah, I am developing a new medical device, so we don't have previous directive certificate. Are these new transition timelines applicable to us?
So no, in this case, you need to apply the MDR from scratch, right? So the transition timelines are applicable in the case that you have a certificate. So your product is already on the market. So in this case, you will need to implement MDR from scratch. And when you have implemented the MDR, you will need to apply to the notified body, like a new product. Then they will review the information, they will emit a certificate, and that will allow you to commercialize under the CE mark. So it's true that in these cases, these manufacturers are maybe in a worse position than manufacturers with existing certificates, precisely because if you already have a notified body, if you're already the client of a notified body, they will always try to prioritize, at some point, your certificate, your products, and you as a client. If you don't have a notified body yet, that difficults a little bit more the situation. And that's why we advise, as we said in the conclusions, right? To implement the MDR as soon as possible. The sooner you have the MDR implemented, the sooner you will be able to contact and provide all the information to the notified body, and the sooner you will be able to obtain the certificate.
Yeah. So more questions here. There is another equivalence related question. I think equivalence is one of the topics that we face. So the question is, ability to claim equivalency for a device delivering a specific drug, but current device on the market not owned by the same device company.
Yeah, I think that more or less the question that I gave before will reply to this answer, to this question, sorry. So again, if you are not the owner of the product that you are claiming equivalency to, that it's almost impossible to justify the equivalency. And in this case, there will be, even additional requirements for the drug combination part, for the drug part. So yeah, I think that the answer that I gave before, it's more or less the same.
Yeah. So one question, another one is, I've heard from the prior speaker that 50% of companies in Europe or Sweden will be out of business due to MDR burden. So I think it's like more a statement than a question, but maybe we can comment on that. Maybe I can elaborate a little bit on that. I don't know if exactly 50% of companies from Europe or Switzerland will be out of business, but one of the reasons why this the extension of the transition period has been suggested by the Commission is because actually several stakeholders around Europe have published reports and have published numbers on this potential disruption of the availability of medical devices. So I don't know if the 50% is the exact number, but yes, there is a significant risk that many companies will not be able to meet these MDR requirements. And I think that, a lot of these reports that have been published also highlight the thing that especially startups, small companies will be facing a lot of problems. And I think that the medtech industry, there are a lot of these type of companies. So this is something also to highlight. Yeah. And then let me see. Yeah, maybe you can close with the last question. There are several questions. As Nicole said before, we'll try to follow up all of them, maybe via email. But maybe the last question that we can, is I am developing a new medical device. Which are the first regulatory steps that I will need to follow in order to start implementing the MDR? I think that you've give already some tips, but maybe you can complement on that.
Okay. Yeah, the first step will be always to understand how the product works, which are the claims that you want to make, right? And understand the classification of the product. Then you need to understand all the applicable testing, all the studies that need to be done and eventually executed, right? Along this, you will need to start preparing the whole package of the technical documentation and be able to submit that information to the notified bodies. So that requires a lot of multidisciplinary effort within a company, or even outside effort, from consultants, for example. So I think that more or less, it's difficult to say in one sentence, which are the steps that you need to carry out. But basically, I think that the most important thing to mention is to understand the claims, right? How is the product working? Which are the functionalities? If that is, which is the classification of the product, and understanding all the applicable testing and regulatory requirements that need to be in place to compile the package. I don't know if that answers as well the question.
Yeah. Okay, so thank Nicole. Yeah.
So we can. Are there more questions, Mercé?
There are several questions, but I don't know if we will have the time to cover them.
We can, Nicole, if we can have access, to the questions, we are happy to reply to them. And sorry that we don't have the time now to go through all of them.
Yeah, no problem. This is great. It's a great problem to have that we have so many questions. People are really interested in these topics. So thank you so much, Anoa and Marcia. Great presentation, wonderful information. As they mentioned, we will provide these questions to the presenters. So hopefully they will be following up with you after the presentation. If you do have direct questions, please feel free to reach out to Alira Health. Obviously, they're a wonderful resource on all of these topics and many more. So thank you, ladies, for your time.
Thank you,
Nicole. Thank you very much.
Hi. Next, we're going to transition to the FDA portion of our program today. So I am pleased to introduce Rhonda Meckel. She is the Deputy Program Director for the Office of Medical Devices and Radiological Health Operations for the FDA. And she's going to be sharing a presentation with us today about FDA priorities for 2023. Rhonda, if you could come on camera and say hi. We're just about to turn it over to you. As we've done in the past, please feel free to feed in your questions through the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer all of them. Rhonda, thank you for joining us today, and I turn it over to you.
Hello there. Can everyone hear me before I switch off screens? Perfect. And I'm going to try and do my little switching. As mentioned, I'm Rhonda Mitchell. I lost you. Hang on. Share my screen. How is that? Now, can you see my screen as well? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yes, I'm Rhonda Mitchell. I am the Deputy Program Director for the Medical Device Program here in FDA. I'm just going to go today through some priorities as they mostly relate to our medical device program. There's a lot of different things going on. In fact, I was just partially listening to another meeting relating to some new bills, new acts, where we're getting new additional authorities. So as usual in the FDA world, just keep staying tuned because things might change for you. As mentioned, I as a deputy program director with the FDA in the medical device program, I have been around more than 30 years. I think even, I'm not going to ignore the fact that FDA has been in the news a lot. We've had the pandemic kind of brought us to an attention. Our food programs and some infant formula shortages brings attention to FDA. Getting emergency use authorizations for pandemic relief, that, all of those things have been going on. So now we're kind of wrapping up, cross our fingers, on the pandemic side of things. And in the ORA and the FDA world, we're just really trying to focus on getting back to order and figuring out what we want to look like in the new world order as we continue our enforcement. So as I mentioned, we are constantly evaluating ourselves, being evaluated, and implementing improvement. So I'm just going to start off with a little bit on just making sure who we are. In 2017, I think prior to 2017, people may have known that we're Office of ORA, and which is the Office of the Regulatory Affairs. The ORA is the lead office for all things in the field. When we say in the field, it's really those of us out, not in the Washington, D.C. area, but we are the ones that are conducting the inspections of all the commodity areas. So in the thing that's hitting the news now is our human and animal foods kind of being separated out and realigning in how they report up. So, I think the commissioner has made some statements on some reorganization. Right now, that a reorganization is impacting foods and foods alone. We do have, in the world of the structure within ORA, essentially the field, the people conducting the inspections are really broken up into two major groups, one being our human and animal side, where the other one is what we call OMPTO, which is the Medical Products and Tobacco Office. And medical devices is within the Office of Medical Products and Tobacco. Just a little screenshot just to show you where we're at. In 2022, when we first program aligned in 2017, going from the geographic base to a product specific organization in the field, we did separate out, and Jan Welch had been our prior director. So in 2022, Ann Reed became our director of the Office of Medical Devices and Radiological Health, which we call ourselves OMDRO. And Ann became the director, and just in the last couple of months, I became her deputy. I just put a little blip. I don't know if you've seen this before, but we separated ourselves by a divisions base, kind of still geographically. Although Minnesota and Florida does not have the same weather, but we do have a little bit of a geographic approach to just organizational management. In this past year, one of the things we are really trying to do is Ann and I are trying to establish that we are one program. Yes, we have 3 divisions, but we're relatively small. And so let's check in with each other a little bit more. Let's make sure that the inspectional approaches, decisions on where we're making our inspectional decisions, where we're making our compliance decisions, that we have a consistent decision process across the board. As I mentioned, there's only 3 divisions. So that means there's 3 directors of compliance branch, there's 3 directors of the investigations branch, and 3 division directors. So not a whole lot of us that need to worry about being on the same page. So we just increase our communication among all of our organization within the OMDRO group to make sure, like I said, we're evaluating things and enforcing same or similar rules. In 2021 or 2022, we did sit down. We all, as I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned, I've been around FDA for 30 years. And we all kind of know what our goal, our vision, protecting consumers, protecting patients has always been an underlying goal and desire of ours. In 2022, we did work with some of our peers in ORA, and each of our program areas established a vision and a mission statement to just remind ourselves why we're here, with that, all patients, providers, and consumers are informed, protected, and have access to safe, reliable medical products and radiological health. And then our mission, again, to minimize risk by supporting access to safe, effective, and quality medical devices and radiological health products. And I bring this statement up. I know, vision and mission statements are important in all organizations, and we really have been using these as our drivers as we create our new priorities or our initiatives, and in communications with our peer center, the Center for Devices and Radiological Health, CDRH. So these are some key components that we are meeting frequently with our partners in CDRH. We have an overview of priorities from OMPTO, the Office of Medical Device Products and Tobacco as well. So we're always referring to and making sure, are we really thinking about the patient? Are we really thinking about the patient safety? What's the risk here, and what are we doing to assist in the mitigation of that risk? So in 2023, we do have based on our initial discussions on what our goals and our vision mission statement is, we do kind of do a cascading from actually our goals and our missions, our priorities from during every year come from HHS, Health and Human Services, which FDA is one of the organizations. So we end up with a high level organizational requirement on what initiatives, what priorities the agency wants to look at, and then they trickle down. I highlighted a couple of them that are at the OMPTO level, which really are coming from the ORA perspective. Having taken a year or so off from doing routine surveillance work during the period of the pandemic, we did reduce our routine surveillance work. However, we did not discontinue conducting inspections on what we felt were mission critical. And those were, especially in the pandemic world, making sure that those products that needed to reach the patients, ensure customer or patient safety, that we were doing what we needed to do as an agency to cover those. So we did look at, we were still continuing to do some of those critical inspectional things. And now that we've kind of transitioned and began to transition, we're taking the opportunity to really look again at making sure, in those 3 years, we didn't go stagnant. We hired employees, people retired. So we are continuing to populate our inspectional base, but now we're back in the field. We recognize that limiting some of, our inspections, trying to get back on board. So one of the goals for ORA and OMPTO is enhancing investigator preparedness. And then I added, the specifically portions of what is OMDRO doing it? What is your device field office doing to help ensure enhanced investigator preparedness? And those things include, as I mentioned, we're bringing staff on board to replace some of our retired employees. We are really looking at trying to reduce the time it takes from bringing someone on board to having them out in the field with confidence to conduct that medical device inspection. So our program is rearranging some of our training and ramping up some of our mentorship. One of the things that we began approximately a year ago is to utilize a program internally. The one thing that happened when we program aligned was we ended up just more distributed across the country. We didn't have concentration of office. So I might have somebody in an office in Nashville that only has 2 peers doing medical device inspections. Or I might have someone in Denver who is by themselves and doesn't have that peer. So we established what we consider as a peer pro group that does have a community of communication. So, you know, they have, it's a free space for investigators to get together. Compliance officers are present to just discuss some of the scenarios that they're all seeing and learning from other mid-career experienced people and having that discussion. So improving the quality and the experiences, hoping that listening to others gains you experience without having to go out there and experience the item for yourself. Optimizing inspectional process. We're looking at our inspectional process from a global view, ensuring that we're implementing our priorities across the program in a global aspect, not just domestically, but also our foreign establishments. I'll have another slide soon about improving communication with CDRH for cause inspection considerations. And a little more improvement on our, just in general, our collaborations with our peer partners over at CDRH. Maximizing our tools for regulatory oversight. You know, we have collaborated with CDRH on some recall process improvement. We have been working on improving our industry's use of UDI to the user facility level, and we will be ramping up some of our enforcement practices in UDI, the unique device identifier, and doing some more evaluations during our inspections in this next coming year. As I mentioned, we've also started working with CDRH as a one device oversight. I know they, you know, at the same time we were program aligning, they reshuffled how their organization looked. And now we're both looking more at a total product lifecycle viewpoint. And we're also creating a quality compliance action team. And that action team is in the works, should be coming out in FY23, but it really is giving us an open communication opportunity to make sure that both sides, CDRH and ORA, if we see a facility we have concerns with, out of compliance with our regulations, what's our best approach in handling bringing our facilities into compliance? Do they need to have additional advisory programs, or what do we need to do to approach our firms to ensure that patient safety is our number one? And one of the other things Joe is doing, which part of me being here, is we are expanding some of our program outreach, making sure that our industry knows who we are, knows that we want to listen. You know, we're always looking for continuous improvement, and we want to be able to make sure that you guys are informed of anything going on within medical devices. In the Joe world, I'm just going to go through a couple quick little things. We kind of took our elements and put them into primary buckets, a workforce, a risk management, partnerships, and strategic directions. And in there again are some of the things we've done internally. And we've created guidance for how to apply any concerns while you're doing an inspection, and you approach and see 510K submissions that don't seem to be matching. What are you going to do with it? The EUA, or emergency use authorization. We created informational tools. Everyone, the information that I've been receiving is that they, you know, according to the White House, we will be rolling out and coming out of the public health emergency in May. When that happens, we are going to, our EUA instructions and guidance will begin transitioning for finding out the facilities who are going to continue to manufacture those products that were under EUA, or those of them who don't do the appropriate submission after the public health crisis has been lifted. So those are things you need to stay tuned if you're making any of those products that were part of the EUA. We will be looking, reviewing post-market signals. As I mentioned, it's kind of happening in both directions. We, and the medical device side, we began monitoring our own information to make sure that we have the data, the realization that we as an agency collect data from industry. We're always collecting data. We haven't always had a really good system that puts all those elements back together. So we have improved what we're calling our signals. If we get consumer complaints, customer complaints, patient user facility complaints, that those are all being coupled in with our information that we have about recalls. Are we seeing what we call a signal? Is there some reason that we need to establish that we should do a for-cause inspection at a facility because of some higher risk activities that we're seeing? I have a little blip on the RRA process improvement coming up in another slide. And then in some of the partnership elements, that PEAK is a patient engagement activity group. We are, if anyone wants to learn more, I see there's a couple comments on the ISO 13485 transition. I'm going to just touch on that really, really high level. But Karen Measley-Joseph will be presenting at MedCon in April, May-ish. And she will have a much more detailed description of 13485. So stay tuned on that. We may have OMJO ourselves as a program may have a rollout as well. I don't think we've made that final decision. And then again, supply chain, we are partnering with our partners over at CDRH and our industry partners to address some supply chain and shortage communications, making sure that when there is a supply chain issue or the potential of shortages, that both CDRH and ORA are aware of these and addressing them early on. And as I said before, our strategic direction is to trying to create a one medical device and radiological health program, not organizationally, as we're kind of seeing, and that's potentially happening in the food world. We're just talking about CDRH and OMJO, improving our communication, making sure that we have formal streams, informal streams that keep us on that one medical device initiative mindset. And again, that 820 transition is a big component of what our operations have been in the last couple of years, and will probably be for a couple more years. I'm going to touch on RRA first. So the RRA, the Remote Regulatory Assessment, the agency put out a guide last winter and out for comment, a guide for industry on remote regulatory assessments. And it was very specific into, we as an agency were trying to establish that there was a difference between an RRA and an inspection. And that in the time of the original document for the guidance for industry, the medical device program did not have authorities that drugs had relating to being able to collect records in advance or in lieu of an inspection. That authority just recently changed with a consolidated appropriations bill of 2023. So we do have some authorities now that original remote regulatory assessment guide for industry that was out there that clearly said devices was voluntary only. That's going to be transitioning to devices has the authority to collect remote records in advance of an inspection or in lieu of. Right now, because we are conducting inspections globally, we're not on the device side, we're not jumping in really quickly on this remote aspect of it. We appreciate having the tool if we find it necessary, but we're kind of taking a little bit of a slower approach, learning from our drug counterparts who had it first, to say, what did you learn here? And make sure that as we transition that authority, that we use lessons learned from our drug counterparts before we move this too far. I'm just going to give a little plug in the OMDRO world. You can go to fda.gov and ORA devices, and that is us. This is a page that is controlled by my program and people in my immediate office, that we put some videos on here on what to expect for an inspection. We have videos on a day in the life of an investigator, a recall coordinator. So you can kind of see what we do here in FDA. We also have some of our primary handouts for our divisions and our inspectors and contacts if you need to get a hold of anybody specifically in the medical device program. So here we go. I think this is what some of you have been waiting for. As I said, I'm not going to go into a lot of specific details. I'm just getting a very high level overview of the 820 transition. So in the 820 transition process, the rule was published right now where we're at. And this is, considering the ISO 13485 and our 820 regulations, how do they match together? What things are we going to keep? And that the draft went out last fall. And now the final rule has been reviewed. We're here. Both CDRH and ORA have reviewed the comments, and we've worked jointly together to evaluate those comments and implement any changes and communicate our rationale back out to our industry on where we're at. I don't know exactly when the final rule will be published. I hear that we're getting very close to clearing all of our comments and our positions. So I don't know exactly what the time frame. I kind of think it's cute that I give you this beautiful little diagram and there are no dates in here at all. So it's because we have some expectations, and we know that there are a lot of hurdles in meeting some of our deadlines and priorities, but it should not be long before the final rule is published. There will be some grace period involved. So, we published the rule in February 2022. Here we go. The proposed rule was open for public until May of 2022, and we're drafting some of those finals. As I said, the revisions to Part 820 replace most of the existing regulation with incorporation by reference to the 2016 13485. What we're doing, what is happening in that rule, hopefully you've seen it. You saw some of our proposed rule, and it withdraws most of the requirements for the current parts. 820 retains some of the scope and a number of the definitions from the 820 part 820. If we felt that the ISO 13485 didn't have some of the definitions, we did retain them in our 820 in the 820's definitions. It does incorporate by reference with some minimal call outs of provisions to ensure consistency with other applicable FDA requirements, including definition, clarity of concepts and requirements. So it's not just simply 1345, it's 1345 with some call outs of provisions that the agency wanted to make sure that were maintained. It includes conforming edits to Part 4 for some of the combination products, but it does not impact the cGMP requirements for combination products. So what we're doing now, incorporation by reference and the proposed QMS key considerations, as I mentioned, any further changes to the standard would need to be evaluated. So we do anticipate, when 13485 comes, we will, as an agency, look at anything new in any future standards and readdress any adjustments that we feel need to be taken into consideration, we again will use our rulemaking process to establish those. The standard availability and C Corporation portal, I did not see if this is still active and open. You may have to check that. We do know there's going to be a transition period between when the rule is finalized and when we will expect conformance to the new regulation. When we do have the new regulation in place, FDA will retain its inspectional authority. We will not result in issuance of certificates. So when FDA investigators, when my staff comes out to conduct inspections, those inspections are not for the issuance of a certificate relating to ISO conformance. Manufacturers with a certificate of conformance to ISO are not exempt from FDA inspections, and FDA will not require that you have 13485 certificates. So it's essentially absorbing the rules for 13485, but enforcing them the way that FDA has always enforced 820s. So in the meantime, we internally were updating technology systems. Our systems weren't built to just have we have some of our 43 observations, our technologies were all written with 820 words in them, and now we have to transition them to the new terminology. We're training our staff and our personnel. We will be replacing, because the QSIT inspectional technique approach isn't going to fit because of the regulations being changed. So we will be replacing our current inspectional model with something that looks different to match some of the approaches that are driven through the 13485 standard. We are revising and developing our internal guidances, our compliance program, and we're reaching out and doing some communication and education with our internal staff and external partners. So I think I gave you 2 minutes left to have any questions. And I will supply a newer version. I did update my presentation from when I sent it, and because I did put on the very end some links of some pretty important things if you want to see when I was talking some of these patient engagement groups. I know FDA is pretty transparent, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can find what you're looking for on our website. So I will send an update of my presentation, and these should be live links that work for everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rhonda. And we will send the presentation out in an email after this webinar. So if you've registered, you'll receive it along with the recording. So we do have 1 minute. So yes. let's take a question. How have DMAP, et cetera, changed the way in which FDA is receiving or analyzing companies' data for things like post-market signals?
I don't know that it has driven any changes in how we do it. It just is easier for us to get that access and having more educated systems to be able to reach the data. Okay.
And we do have a question about an individual who's had quite a lengthy process going from one department to another in the FDA. And now they're actually with your team, it sounds like, OMDRHO. So their question is, how do you avoid kind of getting ping-ponged around the FDA? Are there any good ways to build a strong relationship with your investigator?
So that's if you don't know where to, you kind of have to start with, what am I making, right? Is my thing a drug? Is it a device? Is it a tobacco product? We're very product driven. The one thing, if you are a medical device, I will give all the kudos out there for CDRH. And one of these is actually, I think it's the CDRH strategic priorities and updates, or one of these links brings you to their DICE page, which is the educational outreach page for devices. And if you ever have a question, just simply going to device advice, they will help direct you appropriately. You can also, as I said, my presentation in the device world has links to our medical device program as well. You shouldn't be continually bounced around. Hopefully you reach out to one person and we can assist finding that right communication. But of course, always, ask your investigational individual at your facility as well.
All right. Now that's a tongue twister, device advice. Thank you for your time, Rhonda. It was a pleasure to have you on our program. Great information.
Thank you.
Now we're going to continue our FDA conversation with one of our sponsors, Duane Morris. So I'm going to ask Frederick Ball and Colleen Hill to come on camera. All right. Hi, guys.
Hello, how are you?
Good. Welcome. So Frederick is a partner and Colleen is an associate at Duane Morris. And today they're going to talk to us about recent developments on fraud in the FDA and the theory of false claim liability. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. Take it away.
Hey, good. I guess it's still morning. Good morning. My name is Rick Ball. I'm a partner at Duane Morris, and I am one of the co-leads of our life sciences and medical technology group around the world. Colleen is an associate at Duane Morris. She works with me a lot, and she is one of the associate liaisons to our life sciences and medical technology group. And Colleen has kindly agreed to push the slides. I'm not going to talk the whole time. She's going to talk about half the time. I'm going to talk about half the time, but go ahead, Colleen, next slide, please.
Okay, great.
So I have to give these out because my general counsel requires me to. Nothing in here is intended to provide legal advice. Material presented in here is Colleen and mine and does not represent any opinion of Duane Morris. We are not lawyers, but we'd like to be. We are lawyers. We're not your lawyer, but we'd like to be. And please ask us questions, I guess, through the chat. If we don't know the answer, we'll make something up as we go along. So go ahead, next slide, Colleen. So we're going to talk about fraud in the FDA, and I'm going to talk about it kind of generally, and then Colleen's going to go over some recent developments in the circuits and the district courts and some settlements. And then I'm going to close this out with why, even though this theory is probably, not the strongest, why you may not be out of the woods, even if a court finds that fraud in the FDA is not applicable. Hey, go ahead, Colleen. So the reason this came up, and she'll talk about this, is because of a filing that the Department of Justice made a few months ago. I'll let her talk about that when she talks about it, in a case that was pending in Florida. But basically, fraud in the FDA is a False Claims Act theory. And as I think probably everybody on this call knows, the False Claim Act is a statutory scheme that was developed during the Civil War, when people were shipping rotten horse meat to the troops. And it basically bars any person from presenting a false or fraudulent claim for payment or appeal to the United States. One of the key aspects of the False Claims Act is it allows private attorney generals, in other words, private citizens, to bring claims on behalf of the government. They're called relators. Those claims are qui tam claims. The False Claim Act stems from the doctrine of fraudulent inducement. Basically, if a company induces the government to enter into a contract or makes a claim for payment under something that's false, that is something that should be enforced and that the government should be able to be able to recover for. My theory is, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, is the reason the fraud in the FDA theory is developed is because plaintiffs' lawyers are smart. They know that there's no private cause of action under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And so they often try to work around that. And one of the ways they try to work around that is the fraud in the FDA theory. Okay, go ahead, Colleen, for the next slide, please. Under a fraud on the FDA theory, basically a person has to make a materially false claim. And we're going to talk just about in the medical device arena, when they apply for a 510(k) clearance, de novo designation, or PMA clearance in order to market or sell the product. As a result of that clearance, they then get a Q code or some other way of getting payment by CMS. CMS then makes those payments and thereby resulting in what is claimed to be a false claim and a false payment. Next slide, Colleen. The theory suggests that it doesn't matter whether the agency to whom you make the false representation actually paid the claim. Because in these cases, the allegation is that the defendant made a false representation to FDA that then resulted in CMS making a payment. It's kind of a overall general government theory of liability. So the fraud on FDA, next slide, thank you, Colleen, is distinguishable from other False Claims Act theories for non-covered uses under CMS will not pay for non-covered uses in certain circumstances. They will not pay for, this is not the same as a off-label promotion. This is not the same as a false claim. This is not the same as a promotion for a contraindicated drug. And we've given you a couple examples there. Go ahead, Colleen, next one. It is also not a claim that the product was defective and that was sold materially defective products. Those still are subject to product liability theories and are not the same as a fraud on the FDA theory. And we've provided a couple examples of those also. But oftentimes plaintiffs will make a fraud on the FDA claim along with these product defect, non-covered use claim, off-label promotion claim. And those have resulted in pretty significant settlements. It's not often clear what role the fraud on the FDA claim played in those settlements. But there are some pretty significant settlements, and we put some examples there from a few years ago. Next slide. Now, Colleen is going to talk to you all about a split that is currently in the circuits that has developed on the fraud and the FDA theories and how the different circuits have dealt with them over the last few years.
Thanks, Rick. So the First Circuit is the first circuit that I'm going to talk about. And this circuit has rejected the fraud on the FDA theory. Essentially, the First Circuit has found that a fraud on the FDA theory claim is precluded if the FDA actually didn't, if there's no evidence that the FDA was actually defrauded. And so in this case, the relator failed to plead a causal link between the alleged false statements to the FDA and the later CMS payments of the claims. And so the First Circuit said, well, that's great, but one, you haven't pled the link, and two, FDA never actually withdrew its approval of the product. And so the False Claim Act under this theory is precluded because it's not clear that the FDA was actually defrauded. So that if the FDA was not defrauded, the company that submitted the data to the FDA could not have caused the submission of false claims to CMS as a matter of law. So as I noted, the court there specifically stated that the FDA would have to withdraw its approval or take another official action like a recall to confirm that it was in fact defrauded. And without that confirmation, the FCA claim based on fraudulently obtaining FDA approval could not proceed. And essentially here, the court was saying that it didn't want FDA claims to effectively negate FDA approval. If the FDA wanted to withdraw its own approval, it could do so. So the First Circuit, while saying this, also cautioned that the theory presents practical problems, which you'll see as demonstrated in some of these other cases, in terms of how a relator can actually prove that the FDA would not have granted approval but for these fraudulent misrepresentations. So because that link between the false statement to the FDA and the CMS payments is pretty wide, relators have trouble proving how this FDA alleged defraudment would have actually caused these payments. The Ninth Circuit, however, took a completely different approach. The first case was a 2017 case. I'll call it Campy. In Campy, the Ninth Circuit found that the alleged false claims actually procured these FDA approvals in the first instance. And so there, the relator alleged enough for the Ninth Circuit to say, okay, these false statements made to the FDA procured you the approval. And so then when you got paid for the product, that was as a result of your false statement that was based on the approval. The Ninth Circuit reasoned that it recognized that other courts have cautioned against allowing FCA claims to wade into the FDA's regulatory regime. I believe it's directly referring to the First Circuit, but the Ninth Circuit found that it wasn't the purpose of the FCA to ensure regulatory compliance, but it also wasn't the FDA's purpose to prevent fraud on the government. And so the Ninth Circuit believes that those two things can coexist, and that fraud on the FDA theory under the False Claims Act is viable. However, even in Campy, the court noted that relators face an uphill battle in alleging that materiality of the alleged falsehood to the CMS payments. Later in 2021, the Ninth Circuit heard another fraud on the FDA case and cited Campy, noting that it had previously allowed a fraud on the FDA theory to go through. And so here in the Medtronic case, the relator had actually alleged that the product was not properly cleared for any use. The fraudulent misrepresentation given to the FDA went to the very essence of the bargain, because it not only granted it approval, but it granted it approval for a use that wasn't what the product was actually used for. And so in that case, that fraud went to the very essence of the bargain, which would be FDA approval, which then led to the CMS payments. So in the case, the court specifically distinguished the situation from products that can be used for their stated intended use and the contraindicated use. So there, the court found that the alleged omission of the company's intention to market the products for a contraindicated use was immaterial. However, if the company had actually disclosed that the devices were intended for use in the cervical spine, as opposed to what they disclosed, which is that they were intended for use in a different part of the spine, the FDA would have required a higher class of approval to approve use in the cervical spine. And so in that case, fraud on the FDA, the theory was successful, and so the case went forward. More recently, in July of 2022, in the Southern District of Florida, another FCA case based on fraud on the FDA occurred. And there, the relator argued that an FDCA violation standing alone without anything more should provide the basis for False Claims Act liability. The DOJ filed a statement of interest in the case, and while the DOJ declined to endorse the relator's theory that that FDCA violation alone could provide the basis, the DOJ did say that FDCA violations may be relevant in these cases where those violations are significant, substantial, and give rise to actual discrepancies in the compensation, functioning, safety, or efficacy of the product. And so here the DOJ is clearly saying, we're not saying any FDCA violation is going to cut it, but these violations that go to falsities about safety or efficacy of the product that lead to approval are ones that we're particularly interested in. Ultimately, the Southern District of Florida rejected the relator's theory, like the DOJ, and dismissed the complaint. The Southern District of Florida specifically found that the FCA is not a catch-all for what they called weaselly behavior, and rather it had the purpose of placing the federal government on notice of potential fraudulent claims in relation to its assistance and other spending programs. The court there found that the allegations amounted to a series of regulatory violations whose connection to the payment was tenuous at best, and it refused to sanction the use of FCA as a sweeping mechanism to promote regulatory compliance with the FDCA. However, the court did interestingly note how a regulatory violation could lead to well-pled FCA facts, and there it noted that if the statute governing certain claims expressly conditioned reimbursement on compliance with specific regulatory obligations, for instance, specific portions of the FDCA, then the violation of that obligation is material to the claims. However, that wasn't the case in that case in the Southern District of Florida. Even more recently, in October 2022, the Second Circuit spoke on this theory. It too rejected fraud on the FDA by affirming the district court's dismissal. In that case, the relator argued that a company provided false information in its prior approval supplement and during its pre-approval inspection. And these false statements specifically related to CGMP compliance, essentially arguing that the lack of CGMP compliance was a violation of the FDCA. That is a false statement that procured the approval based during the PAI and PAS. And so ultimately any claims that were paid based on that approval were false. So there, the relator argued that the company knowingly and or recklessly secured FDA approval to sell the drugs on the basis of false representations to the FDA and then manufactured those drugs in violation of GMP. But the court ultimately determined that compliance with CGMP is not material to the payment. So again, we're seeing this issue with how people are able to allege materiality between these false claims and the payments. And so the court noted, in addition to alleging a particular misrepresentation, a plaintiff must plead facts sufficient to plausibly allege that the misrepresentation is material. And there, the relator actually acknowledged itself that not every violation of CGMP is material. And so in this case, the theory failed. So the FCA defines materiality in general as having a natural tendency to influence or be capable of influencing the payment or receipt of money or property. And in assessing materiality, they look to the effect of likely or actual behavior on the recipient of the alleged misrepresentation rather than on superficial designations. And so here, the Second Circuit essentially said random violations of CGMP are not actually material and are not going to be enough to carry the day under fraud on the FDA theory of liability. And finally, this brings us to December of 2022. This is interesting because it's a settlement with the DOJ. And so it wasn't a court case that actually rendered liability here. They settled out of court. And the DOJ announced that Advanced Bionics settled these FDA claims based on fraud on the FDA liability for $12 million. In this case, the relator alleged that the company misrepresented information about radio frequency emissions generated by a cochlear implant device system in a PMA application. More specifically, essentially what the allegation was is that during the testing stage of this, the company failed to use what they called worst case testing scenarios to look at the radio emissions frequencies to see if the radio frequencies could be interrupted by other devices. And so there, the real problem was that the company claimed that the device satisfied this international standard when it did not, and it could not have because the testing wasn't sufficient enough. The DOJ noted that the United States, and this is in the press release of the settlement, that the United States expects device manufacturers to provide accurate information when they claim that devices meet certain standards. They noted that the integrity of our healthcare system depends on the government being able to rely on the information provided by manufacturers when they apply for permission to market their devices. And the settlement in the case demonstrates their commitment to hold responsible any medical device manufacturer that skirts these rules and seeks FDA approval of a device that it knows is not as effective as represented. Of course, the company in the statement essentially said, there's no allegation that our device actually is not effective. The real problem was with the testing. And so despite those debates, they settled out of court for $12 million. And so that is the most recent thing we've seen on this theory. Some takeaways: fraud, given the settlement that just happened, fraud on the FDA liability is alive and well, despite some of these case holdings that trend otherwise. As Rick noted in the beginning, it's pretty hard to succeed on one of these claims, but that does not mean the DOJ isn't using it to try to force compliance, especially in areas that would affect safety and efficacy. So as my slide notes, the DOJ has demonstrated it has a substantial interest in the development of law in this area and then the correct application of law in this area and in similar cases. And now Rick's going to talk about, even if the court determines there is no fraud on the FDA, you're not out of the woods yet. And Rick, I think you're muted.
I didn't want to step on Colleen while she was speaking. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Colleen.
Okay.
I'm sure I'm the only one who's been muted when they were trying to speak on Zoom. So we've seen instances where a fraud on the FDA, a qui tam action that becomes public or even has not become public has then resulted though in FDA taking enforcement action outside of the fraud on the FDA, either through asking the company to conduct a recall, sending a warning letter, seizing the devices, asking the company to enter into some kind of consent decree, or even potential criminal prosecution, including under the Park Doctrine, which is the non-scienter criminal prosecution, misdemeanor prosecution under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And these can result in money payments to the company, civil forfeitures, and disgorgement. So you have to, even if you are successful in defending a fraud on the FDA theory, as we discussed at the very beginning, often those are coupled with other theories, and there still may be regulatory action by FDA and or the Department of Justice acting through FDA. I think we're about out of time, but we're happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
All right. Thanks, Rick and Colleen. We are actually at time, so unfortunately, we're going to have to go to the next speaker. But if you do have questions, feel free to feed them in, and we will share them with Colleen and Rick after. You can also obviously reach out to them directly. So thank you both for joining us today. Appreciate your time and the great information.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
you.
Thanks for attending.
Thanks. Now we're going to shift into the last portion of our program, taking a deeper dive into digital health and cybersecurity. To kick things off, I would like to welcome Ben Linville Engler. He's going to give us a presentation on a resource in our own backyard that you may not know about. It's called the Mass Cyber Center, and I will turn it over to him to tell you more. Thanks, Ben.
Great, thanks, Nicole, and appreciate everyone having me join. We're going to cover quite a bit of ground in a really short period of time, but by way of introduction, Nicole said my name is Ben Linville Engler. I serve as the Chief Investment Strategist and Program Executive at the Massachusetts Technology Collaborative. This is home to our Mass Cyber Center, and I'll cover sort of how we fit into our state ecosystem and then some of our other organizations. When I first joined about 20 minutes ago, I had a little bit of shell shock. I previously worked in the med device surgical systems space as a VP of product development and engineering, and spent a lot of time working through quality management and regulatory resources with the FDA, and first met MassMEDIC through the state's manufacturing emergency response team effort for COVID, and happened to be our primary liaison with the FDA then. So I will not talk about all of that fun stuff, but I'm here to share more about Mass Tech and the Mass Cyber Center. So we are a quasi-state economic development agency at a really high level. It's helpful for you guys to think of us as a .org, not a .gov, but we do report into the executive branch of our state government. This is our Governor, Maura Healey, and in particular, we report into Secretary Yvonne Howe, who's the Secretary of Economic Development. We are one of what is considered a constellation of economic development agencies. Some of you have probably heard of the Mass Life Sciences Center, or Mass Ventures, or Mass Development, or the Mass Clean Energy Center that reports into our Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretariat. We all have different tools in our toolbox to help promote economic development across a number of sectors in the state. Specifically to Mass Tech, our mission is to strengthen the competitiveness of the tech and innovation economy. We do that through strategic investments, partnerships, and insights that harness the talent across the Commonwealth. And we were established in state statute in 1982. Now, our mission and the sectors and the technologies that we support have evolved over time, over the last 40 plus years. And right now we are organized across 5 different divisions. The Innovation Institute focuses on emerging technology cluster development. Our Center for Advanced Manufacturing focuses on manufacturing. We have a Broadband Institute that's working through connectivity and digital equity. And then the two divisions that I'll talk just briefly about in the next few minutes are MIHI, our eHealth Institute, and then our Mass Cyber Center. And while I'll talk a lot about technology, this all has to do with the people across the Commonwealth and how do we connect them to the right resources or the right partners on different projects and time periods in their product or business development lifecycle. So a few programs I want to highlight. One is through our eHealth Institute. MIHI is led by our director, Keely Benson, who I think is here and can answer questions as needed or put some links in the chat. But our Digital Health Sandbox Network is a collection of 12 cutting-edge research and development resources across the state. And what we do is help to connect and do matchmaking of interesting startups with these resources to help them de-risk clinical parts of their technology, maybe their technology itself, usability, or business plan. And in particular, in the context of cybersecurity, 3 of our sandbox resources do provide support for this. MITRE, the Plug and Play Lab at Mass General Brigham, as well as the Practice Point facility out at WPI. And we can put some links in the chat, or we'll send these slides out afterwards for those of you that are more interested in this particular program. We currently have an open opportunity around healthy aging. Now, for the Mass Cyber Center, this is where we're really looking at how do we help support cybersecurity activities and economic development across the Commonwealth by, again, looking at our people, processes, and technology. And our work has spanned municipalities and helping with cybersecurity resiliency, as well as connecting into our health systems and helping them think about the different potential threat landscapes, if you will, for them, whether it's new devices, critical infrastructure, or a host of other things. We also work really closely with the Executive Office of Technology and Technology Services, as well as the Executive Office of Public Safety, to ensure that folks know that when they are maybe under a cyber threat or cyber attack, what resources exist in the state to help connect them into response plans as well. So for this audience, as it relates to those of you that are developing new medical devices and products, we are working through developing a more robust offering around cyber by design, which has to do with your product development lifecycle and a lot of what the FDA is looking for in your submissions, but also connecting then with our manufacturers in the state to ensure that our supply chains are also secure from a cybersecurity standpoint. But also for you as a company yourself, it's not just about creating safe and effective products as it relates to cybersecurity, but you may also want to be protecting your own IP or ensuring that you guys are also safe or protected from potential vulnerabilities that might cause damage to your company or other issues. And so those are opportunities to engage with us as well. And the third or the last piece there I'll say just at the bottom has to do with our talent pipeline. And so we always take an economic development or workforce perspective to this. So we have a number of programs where we're helping develop mentorship opportunities for students interested in getting into cybersecurity, but then also some workforce development programs to get hands-on experience in security operations centers or other areas within some of our academic institutions. In particular, for this crowd, we host a monthly healthcare provider cybersecurity call. This has started in 2020, really in looking at our healthcare providers. However, we have started to have more medical device companies join. These meetings generally start with a cyber threat update from folks that we know at Homeland Security, as well as the Massachusetts State Police Commonwealth Fusion Center, which is the central point for cybersecurity coordination across the Commonwealth. And then we generally have a special guest that's going to give a talk around the potential landscape as it relates to cybersecurity in the healthcare space. There's a few examples listed there of topics and speakers that we've had recently or that are coming up. One of our cyber ecosystem program managers, Max, has listed his email at the bottom. So feel free to reach out to him if you'd like to register for any of those. So I know I went through quite a bit really quickly, but just know that we are a resource and we can help to direct you towards different opportunities but we also like to hear about what your needs are or things that you might be struggling with that we might be able to help put some programs or resources towards in the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. And as Ben said, we're going to send out his slides after the webinar, so you will have his and his team's contact information. So please do feel free to reach out to him and get engaged. So it's a great resource we have in Massachusetts. Appreciate all you're doing. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Now I would love to welcome the gentleman from Intertech on, who we're going to talk about cybersecurity considerations for regulated medical devices. I'm pleased to introduce Joe Dawson. He is the Principal Software Security Analyst for Intertech, and George Strom, who is the Business Development Director of IoT. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you both. Thank you. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So if we can progress to the next slide. I do apologize for the technical difficulties there. Thank you everyone for letting Joe and I join you today. I've been working with Joe for the past 6 years, really creating some tremendous framework with the medical device community. And Joe himself is a wealth of information. He's been doing product-based cybersecurity for the better part of 30 years. So a tremendous resource for all device manufacturers. And he works very closely with all clients to understand, it's a very customized approach because everyone has a different product, different concerns. So without further ado, Joe and I are going to go through very quickly some questions that we get on a great regularity from our clients. So if we could proceed to the next slide, Nicole. One of the biggest drivers that we see out there, just kind of a state of the union, and I find this stat to be amazing, is that the average hospital bed has 10 to 15 connected devices. And obviously that creates potential risk, as you would hope that all things are equal in an ecosystem, but we know they're not. And equally, obviously from an EMC perspective, it creates concerns, but now from a cybersecurity perspective, creates concerns. And the other phenomenon we've had in the past 4 years really is the pandemic. We have non-traditional products going into the home healthcare arena when previously they were in a secure environment. So that's really has created a lot of change. So if we could proceed to the next slide, Nicole, I appreciate that as well. So Joe, when we talk to our clients today, probably the most pervasive question we get is, where do I start?
Absolutely. And thanks, George. So, all of our clients are in different aspects of the development of a product. So some have a mature product that's ready to go to market. Some have products that are still under development. But I think where I always recommend you start is to do the cyber risk assessment. And what I mean by a cyber risk assessment is look at what are the potential harms if the software or hardware was to fail. So if the software was to send a laser, just one second. For example, some of the software we look at controls lasers. So if that software was to send a high-powered laser signal to someone, what would be the impact of that and what potential harm could take place? And that can be fixed through both software and hardware limitations. So make sure you understand all those risks that you have, and then develop your hardware and software mitigations for those. So you programmed your software to limit the power of the laser. You've done certain things, either from a hardware and software perspective, to do that. And you document all of those. Once you've done all of that, you then start to do vulnerability assessments where we look at, if we were to take an attack on those mitigations that you've put in place, whether or not we can bypass those. So often clients will, after they've done the risk assessments, they will give us a product or one that comes in our lab, and we will try to see whether or not we can mitigate or get around some of those vulnerabilities, those mitigations that put in place, and without any vulnerabilities. And that's sort of the vulnerability and pen testing. And then beyond that, a lot of devices are connecting to the cloud, and the cloud may have the ability to update the software on the device or make changes to the device. So making sure that the cloud component doesn't have a negative impact on the device or couldn't be used by a bad actor to do something negative to the device. And that also applies to mobile apps. And of course, the backward compatibility is something that we see where people are taking devices that exist today and then adding internet connectivity to them, and then creating new risks on devices that previously weren't cyber, or making sure on a backward compatibility level that their device works with all the different types of cell phones or different types of Android devices or iPhones that are out there. So there's a lot of aspects of backward compatibility that we have to look at.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Next slide, please. I guess, Joe, one of the latest documentations put forth by the FDA last April is the evolution of the software bill of materials. Can you give a high level, explain what a software bill of materials is for our clients or for the people?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So when it comes to the software bill of materials, we have this sort of Lego diagram over there. And the vendor code is the stuff that you've written in your company or you've had written. But when that's just the code that you developed and that's your secret sauce, if you will. But often that's built on top of open source libraries or other third-party libraries. And then there's device drivers, and then there's operating systems underneath that. So when it comes to your software bill of materials, the FDA wants to see the whole thing. They want to know what operating systems you're using, what versions, what drivers, what software is there, what open source libraries you have, as well as the code that you've written. And they want to know that you have a process for managing those and looking at those, that you're monitoring for potential vulnerabilities in operating systems of the device that you use, that you're monitoring for device drivers and open source libraries that you're using, that you're keeping all of that. So it's really understanding the full build of the software material that goes into your device, and making sure that you have a strategy, not just for updating the code which you wrote, but all the code that makes up the entire software bill of materials, and that you have a way of patching, updating, and maintaining that throughout the life cycle of your product.
Excellent. Thank you, Joe. Next slide, Nicole. So, Joe, I in the introduction, I referenced that the pandemic has put forth, or brought forth, I should say, traditional products that were in, say, a secure healthcare environment, and now they're in the home. What are some of the new challenges that this represents to manufacturers?
Well, it's a great point, because when we look at a device, oftentimes we look at the environment it's used in. And some people will say that, well, our medical device is only going to be used in a hospital environment, so we don't have to worry about someone plugging a bad USB stick into it or doing certain things. They consider, some manufacturers consider that's not something I have to worry about. I don't have to worry about someone trying to guess a password or hack into a device, because they're not going to have physical access to it, because the physical thing is going to be in a secure location. And then the pandemic happened, and all of these devices, or some of these devices, then got placed in environments where those controls didn't exist, or they're on bad home Wi-Fi networks, or they're on Wi-Fi networks that aren't always available, or have malware on that network that they're on, or viruses on that network. And these devices, while they're medical devices, sometimes are still built on top of Windows or Android or other operating systems which have vulnerabilities and can be compromised in those home environments, those insecure home environments, just like any other device in an insecure home environment. So really making sure that your device is secure for the environment it's in, and the risk of that environment is very crucial. And there's a big difference between being in an operating room and a very sterile network with that you have 100% control of, that you have 100% trust over those individuals, versus being in someone's home where there's all kinds of malware floating around in the home network, and gosh knows what the potential problems are. And as we're pointing out, every device in a house now is connected to the internet, and just one of those devices being compromised could then negatively impact the medical device that's now sitting on that home network.
Thank you, Joe. Next slide, Nicole. I guess the Joe is the question is common issues that you in your 30+ years, and really the past 5 or 6 years, you've experienced directly with medical device manufacturers that have created some, I guess, consternation with our clients. So from a personal experience, could you shed some light on that for us?
Absolutely. One of the, and I hate to be If anyone's listening to this and says that I'm slagging on Android, I apologize. I'm not trying to, because Android's a very good and secure operating system. But it's just that it's very popular now to be putting that in medical devices, sort of like the one on the screen here now, or some sort of tablet device. And what people forget is it's still an Android device. And if you hold down, let's say, the power button and the reset button on Android as you're turning the device on, you get into the special bootloader mode, which gets you into a low-level operating system on it and lets you do massive changes to the device. And those capabilities are built into the operating system. And generally on smartphones and Android tablets, that's a great thing that's there, that you can get into the safe mode and do all these great things in case your device fails. On a medical device, it's a terrible thing because it allows someone to get in there and change the underlying software on the medical device and get in before your software even starts, and allows them to make some really bad security changes to the device. So making sure that you're not just thinking about your software, but what your software is running on top of, the hardware and the software, whether or not there's any vulnerabilities in that. We also see a lot of manufacturers connecting legacy devices to the internet, where the device itself had no cybersecurity because it's never a cybersecurity device. And then someone picks a module and slaps a module on the side of it, and now it's got remote access, or it can be viewed over the internet, or it has that. And when that device in its initial design didn't have any cybersecurity in mind, just adding a little component to the back that just gives remote view or something could create a whole number of cyber problems that you really need to consider. So when you're taking legacy devices that didn't have the internet in mind and adding that to it, that's a big risk. And generally, the other one is just adding functionality without consideration of risk. We've seen devices which have the ability to allow doctors to configure a device so that it operates a certain way, so that when the doctor goes in the operating room, he can log in, and this will set this medical device up to be configured the same way it is in every operating room where he goes to it. And so it goes out over the cloud, grabs his configuration and throws it on the device. And they consider that in some cases, when I read the risk assessments, to be a low risk activity, when in actual fact it's a very high risk activity, because if that configuration is not the way the doctor thinks it is, then perhaps when he puts his foot on a certain pedal, it will do not the behavior he expects, but something else. So having this remote configuration or ability to download configuration, just adding simple functionality, which just seems to be a nice to have, sometimes can create massive risks if you're not fully considering the impact of those changes.
Excellent. Next slide, Nicole. Joe, a lot of our clients have questions about their ports, custom ports, USB ports. Why is this a concern for the medical device community?
Well, that's a great one. Because with the medical devices, we have a situation where a lot of them are using unusual ports, like on this device, where it's not a standard USB plug, or it's not a standard Ethernet jack. But it's actually, when we look at these devices and we look at the wiring on it, it's an unusual cable, but the underneath protocol is still a serial port, or it's still a USB port, or it's still a network port. That still has all the risks of those ports, and you still need to make sure that you're doing appropriate fuzzing and testing on all of these ports. And just changing the jack to something that's non-standard doesn't remove a problem. It's known in the security industry, it's known as security by obscurity. It's sort of when you make a plug look different, it's like obscure, and you think, well, no one will know what that is. We can take those plugs, and any hacker can as well, and plug them into what's called a protocol analyzer. And within seconds, we can tell you what kind of port this is, what all those pinouts are actually for. So don't think that you're saving yourself by doing that. We are looking at the communications. It's also understanding the operating system and drivers behind those ports, because sometimes we'll fuzz USB ports on medical devices, as for example, and the devices start crashing. And it's not because of the software you wrote that necessarily is crashing, could be, but it can often be that the operating system hasn't been fully updated, or the drivers for the USB ports haven't been fully updated, as an example. And that can cause the devices to crash, and crash in bad ways that makes the actual operation of the medical device inactive. The other thing that I've heard frequently said is things like RFID and NFC aren't in scope from a security perspective, and they totally are. So any communication, even short range communications, we had to look at it. We had to make sure that it doesn't add any risk, and that we're doing testing, and we have the ability in our lab to test all of these things if necessary.
Excellent. Next question, Nicole. Joe, obviously you stated earlier in the first slide, there's a growth in cloud connectivity. From your perspective, how does this impact the cybersecurity risk, and what are some best practices you could recommend for cloud connectivity?
Absolutely. So, the slide talks about some of the risks that are there, but to go beyond just what the slide talks about, there is an organization called OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, and they've written a number of standards for everything cloud-based and how to do testing and methodologies for doing testing. And we use those methodologies in our labs every day. But it's really important that when you connect a device to the cloud, that you understand what you're giving up and what control you're giving up. And that, are you sure first that the cloud is, there for you, and that it's your cloud that you're connecting to? But beyond that, if your cloud gets compromised, if somebody was to get in your Amazon backend services, what would they be able to do to the devices, and what's the risk for that perspective? Because, Amazon and Microsoft Azure and all of these systems can be compromised. And generally they're compromised because of poor configuration. So all of these manufacturers of cloud services have best practices for configuration. All of them have the ability to have two-factor authentication. You should always have that on whenever possible, but really ensure that your cloud is set up the best way possible. Do the best you can, and then if you want, get some independent third-party testing to make sure that you're meeting the best practice for that cloud configuration. Because if a device is vulnerable, I now, as a hacker, have to go and find every device in every hospital and hack it. If your cloud is vulnerable, once I hack the cloud, I have access to all of your devices. So it becomes a one point where I can now disseminate from that point and reach out to all your devices. So it's really critical that the cloud, now is becoming it's a savior from the sense of it's great to have all that information in one place, but it also creates a huge risk for medical devices that are getting updates, especially via the cloud.
Excellent. Next slide, Nicole. I guess, Joe, this is a really high level question. It's tough to validate, but we have clients that are talking about, how do I know my device needs cybersecurity, or what type of products are in scope for medical device cybersecurity at a global level? As we have the FDA, but we have other countries and other regions around the world that have similar requirements. So what would be your high level view of, a practice or a fundamental understanding and belief of what medical device cybersecurity entails?
Well, it's so broad, George. And I think that I'll go back to even say that it's not necessarily even a device. We now do testing of cloud services. So some medical device companies are doing software as a service, and that needs to be tested. So it's not even a device. But as far as the devices go, basically, it's almost everything now that has connection. And I should be clear to say, even if your device is not internet connected, that doesn't mean you don't have risks. So your device is just standalone, sits out there, all that. If you've got USB ports, if you've got serial ports, if you've got interfaces on them, people could physically walk up to the device, put malware in them, or try to do things with them. And one of the things we're considering is the fact that if somebody, while the device is not being used, while the device may be sitting in a storage cabinet or in a storage closet, if somebody was to plug in that device and put malware on that device, so the next time we wheel it out, we hook it up to a patient, it's actually got some remote control or malware capability on it. It's a real problem. Also, you have to understand that from a hacker's perspective, a hacker who breaks into a hospital network, if your device is on the network, they don't know that your device is not a PC or something. So when they scan and find vulnerabilities, they just see you as another Linux, another Unix, another Windows machine, and they may infect your machine just as they infect all the other machines in the hospital. So you really need to be aware of that. But making sure you have the ability to update your firmware and your software on your device is critical, because I don't think there's such a thing as a device that does not have any vulnerabilities. It's just a matter of when they get found. So make sure that you have a plan for when those vulnerabilities get identified, and make sure you have a plan for how you're going to patch and update, and do regular testing, because even a device that is secure today, 6 months or a year from now, new vulnerabilities come out that didn't exist, and no one looked for them 6 months ago, and now we do it. So the testing that we do on a device year to year is always changing, because it's always getting new vulnerabilities out there. And then understanding your organizational controls, having some organizational standards and controls that are in place to manage your software development, your life cycle, and all that, and have that throughout the organization is really critical.
Excellent. Nicole, do we have time for a couple questions? We'll take her silence as a yes. So we have a couple questions here, Joe. And we'll try to keep it brief, because I know we're pressed for time here. One question, Joe: what would be the easiest and most secure OS to deal with when developing software for medical devices?
Oh gosh, I wish that existed. I think that there are versions of Linux which are very secure, that can be a good option. But I think it's really understanding that you have a path for updating and patching the software. I don't want to say that any one software is or operating system is key. There are very secure versions of Linux that could be good, but there's nothing wrong with Android. There's nothing wrong with Windows if that's what you want to use. It's just making sure you have a process for managing and updating it. Even if it was a very secure version, you still need to have a way to patch it, update it. So that's probably even more important than the software you pick.
Okay, Joe, one last question. If the network features required to the medical device needs only to access some of the hardware on that device and not the whole system, would dividing the software into two softwares that communicate with each other make it more secure?
It would. It would even, I'll take you a step further. I'll take that and raise it one, if they will.
Okay.
And that I'd raise it by saying, could you have two separate processors in the unit, where basically the medical functions, the things that are connected to the patient, are running in one processor, and then you have another part of your unit that's doing the nice to have features, like maybe the internet connectivity, so that if one side crashed, the critical functions could continue on. So sort of think about it from that perspective, that you say you've got it in two separate pieces, but if they're both on the one processor and I crash one of them, am I crashing both, or do you have it thought out? You may have it thought out, and maybe I do one processor, but keep in mind that if the worst case scenario happens on the part that you want to allow, make sure that can't negatively impact the other half of the device. But it's a great idea.
Great. We have one last question. Hopefully, Nicole, we don't impede on Dr. Schwartz's time. The last question: the medical device travels globally with the user. How do you address the potential issues to keep it serviceable?
The medical device travels globally to you. Well, that's a great question. I think that you can have the ability for the device through, let's say, a cell phone to be connected to the internet, so that basically maybe the user has a mobile app on their phone that downloads the latest patches and updates and then pushes that to the device if that's a device that they're carrying with them. So that would be something that I would consider. And we have a lot of companies that do that. And there's very secure processes for doing this, which I'm sort of glossing over, but there's a concept of signing software so that you know the phone is validating that it's getting the right software from the right place. And then when it gets pushed from the phone to the device, the digital signature is used to make sure that the device is only accepting the valid software from that original manufacturer. But using cell phones might be an approach.
Excellent. And with that, Nicole, we have no additional questions. So hopefully we didn't run too long. And thank you for the assist on the
Oh, my
the
pleasure.
Thank you very
I
much.
appreciate-
Thank you very much.
egg on my face, but I appreciate it greatly.
No problem. Glad to have you both. Lots and lots of really useful information as always. I think we need to have another webinar just to talk about, all of those considerations, because obviously there's tons of questions and tons of interest.
It would be our pleasure to do so.
Thank you
Absolutely.
for being here today. Now I'm going to turn it over to our last speaker for the day. We have a keynote, and it's going to be moderated by one of our sponsoring organizations. So I'm pleased to introduce Amra Rasik. She is the Senior Director of Government Strategy for Viva Systems. And she's going to come on and give you a little bit of an overview of what's going to occur. And then we're going to hear from our keynote today, Dr. Suzanne Schwartz. She's the Director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at CDRH, part of the FDA. So thank you both for being with us today, and I will turn it over to Amra to start us off.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. So as Nicole mentioned, my name is Amra Rasik, and I'm with Viva Systems. I have responsibility for global government strategy for the MedTech division. I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Schwartz, Suzanne Schwartz, who is the Director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation at CDRH. I think it's important that you have just a little bit of background on Dr. Schwartz here so that you know who you are engaging with here. But Suzanne's work in the medical cybersecurity includes raising awareness, educating, outreach, partnering, and coalition building with the healthcare and public health sector, as well as fostering collaborations across the government agencies and the private sector. Suzanne has been recognized for excellence in innovation at FDA's Women History Month for her work in medical device cybersecurity. Most recently, she received the 2021 Ruthie Award from the HISAC for her leadership in cybersecurity in healthcare, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. Together with Health Canada, Suzanne has also represented the agency in co-chairing the IMDRF working group on medical device cybersecurity, leading to its first international guidance publication in March of 2020, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. She chairs CDRH's cybersecurity working group tasked with formulating FDA's medical device cybersecurity policy, and has additionally served as the co-chair of the Government Coordinating Council for the HPH critical infrastructure sector, focusing on the sector's healthcare cybersecurity initiatives. Suzanne earned her medical degree from Albert Einstein College of Medicine and executive MBA from NYU Stern School of Business, completed cohort X of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, Harvard School of Public Health, and Harvard Kennedy School of Government Executive Education, and earned in September of 2018 a Certificate of Mastery for completion of requirements at the Federal Executive Institute, Leadership for a Democratic Society. This is very impressive, Dr. Schwartz, and I'm sure we've only just barely scratched the surface of all of your accomplishments with this brief info. But again, due to timing, I'd like to turn it over to you now to go over some of your department's current responsibilities and some of the latest updates on the key policies that I know we're all interested in.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Amra, for those very kind opening remarks. And while we're pulling up the slides, let me just say, having now had the privilege and the opportunity to hear our prior speakers, that I wish I could just stand up and give a standing ovation. Joe's remarks, Joe's responses to the questions were on point, and I'd like to say it makes our job easier at FDA. I don't know if that's the case, but certainly it reduces a lot of the complexity that we deal with in the medical device cybersecurity realm. And it certainly tees us up well for today's talk. Amra, as you mentioned, I'm the director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships Technology Innovation, also known as OST. We do have a very broad portfolio, and perhaps we can come back at some other time and talk about some of the other areas of novel interest where we are really looking to be at the tip of the spear. For today's talk, I'm going to focus primarily on latest updates with respect to medical device cybersecurity, as well as touch on a little bit of what's happening with respect to the broader digital health Center of Excellence, our digital health program, as we have lots of things happening there as well. So let's move on to the next slide. And it's quite exciting, to talk about this. It's still very, very fresh that we recently received new authorities that are explicit for medical device cybersecurity as a result of the omnibus that was signed at the end of last year. And this includes a section specifically on ensuring cybersecurity of devices. Its focus is really primarily, again, on the pre-market piece. I want to say that because really, as was even mentioned in the earlier presentation, there's a lot of legacy technology out there, a lot of legacy medical devices, which have a very long tail in terms of their use life, in terms of the vulnerabilities and the exposures that they present. We recognize the importance of really trying to cut that cycle, that vicious cycle of having legacy technology out there that is difficult to patch, impossible to patch, representing, again, emerging vulnerabilities and therefore presenting difficulties, potential risks for patient safety. And so the notion of being able to address this at the very, very beginning in terms of mandating requirements that FDA can then utilize in its review of pre-market submissions becomes paramount. And we're very, very fortunate to have received these new authorities. So the language within the statute talks about a cyber device. We'll get to what that means shortly, but it speaks to the different provisions within the Act around having policies and procedures in place to address vulnerabilities and exploits, including CVD, Coordinated Vulnerability Disclosure, that manufacturers are required to have such, that there needs to be design, development, and maintenance of processes and procedures that provide reasonable assurance. Beyond that reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, we're now talking about that in the realm of cybersecurity. And that means that, again, from the very, very beginning stages, not bolted on, but baked in, that devices can be updated and patched, and that the necessary materials in the submission to the agency at the time of the pre-market has to include various evidence of the ability of that device to be updated and patched. It also calls out specifics of the software bill of materials, the SBOM, that was touched on a little bit earlier. We have in it the inclusion of the capability for FDA to draft regulations for additional requirements. We also have the ability for FDA to exempt certain devices from meeting cybersecurity requirements. This is the core that I'm going to put my emphasis on with respect to today's discussion. There are other aspects that were included in the omnibus in cybersecurity, but they're a little bit peripheral to, I think, what this audience really wants to hear. So next slide. Cyber device, and its definition includes software validated, installed, or authorized by the sponsor as a device or in a device has the ability to connect to the internet and contains any such technological characteristics as indicated here on this particular slide. I think, really the key point that I want to emphasize here, which Joe mentioned as well, and so preaching to the choir really, is that the capability of connection can exist in multiple different manners. And it is important to consider what that risk is and how we're viewing cyber device as a result of that risk, whether that connection is direct to the internet or not. Next slide. So we've been on this journey now for a bunch of years already, right? FDA initiated guidance on cybersecurity from the pre-market through the post-market, coming back around to the pre-market again most recently. But this goes back to our 2013-2014 timeframe. The key element that really warrants further emphasis here is that recognition that we consider cybersecurity to be a factor in patient safety, and that a safe device has to be, for a device to be safe, it needs to be cyber secure as well. And while we have iterated on guidances over the past years, we've also been able to recognize those areas where, in addition to what we've stated in guidance as our thinking around policy, there are areas of gap which really merited the advancement of those specific authorities of really mandating those requirements. We stated that not only in terms of the proposals that we had put forward around potential legislation in the past, we've also included that in what was called a Medical Device Safety Action Plan in 2018. And it's a journey we've been on all this time, which again now culminates in the delivery of the omnibus authorities. To again point to the fact that there are presently several guidances, which both the pre-market 2014 final, the 2022 draft that we issued back in April of last year, and the post-market guidance in 2016 as final, as important cornerstones to this journey, this trajectory that we've been on. Next slide. And I'm conscious of the time, so I am going to try to run through things quickly so we have time for Q&A. As I mentioned, we issued a draft cyber guidance, which is essentially, again, that iteration or an update around the 2014 and then subsequently a 2018 draft. And this is testament to not only the evolution in thinking within this particular field, but the recognition of the agency as well as our stakeholders that this is an area of continued emergence of threat and of concern, and that therefore it warrants really raising the bar. The comment period for the draft guidance, pre-market guidance, closed over the summer. We have reviewed all of those comments. We have had pen to paper. We are in the process of finalizing that particular guidance so that it can go out as final. We've been public about the fact that it is on our A-list for guidance publication by the end of fiscal year 2023, which would be, September 30th or by October 1st. That is our target. And with the omnibus now out there, which puts various authorities in place and requirements in place, of course, that drives us to even try to get things done as quickly as possible. Just a note that it does not replace any other guidances that were issued as final. So the post-market management of cybersecurity and medical devices stands as is as an implementable guidance. Next slide. So you heard a little bit about software bill of materials, or SBOM, earlier, and not to belabor the point, but I think that the visual, the graphic on this slide really highlights the issue, which is that you've got a chain, in essence, of software that can be embedded in a finished product. And within those different nodes, you can have vulnerabilities. And unless the owner, user, operator of that device has awareness of the component parts of the finished product, it becomes a very, very difficult, daunting, some might say impossible task to be able to appropriately mitigate risk within that finished product. Hence the importance of having that SBOM, that software bill of materials. And not only sharing it with the regulator, with us, as is stated in the statute, but the importance of manufacturers sharing that information with their customers so that their customers are well positioned in terms of being able to appropriately manage risk of devices that are on networks or in different locales. Next slide. And just a little bit of history here on SBOM activities, because we didn't pull this out of the air, obviously. We've been working together with other agencies for several years already, mainly out of Department of Commerce, NTIA, that had established a working group, a public-private working group in which we were active back several years. And over time, included the concept of the SBOM. We actually initially called it a CBOM, Cybersecurity Bill of Materials, in a 2018 pre-market guidance draft. We've obviously also included it within our more recent April 2022 draft guidance as SBOM, specific to software bill of materials. And for those of you who are directly engaged in our IMDRF, our International Medical Device Regulators Forum activities, you know that we put out a guidance initially in 2020. We have actually also further iterated on that, and there are 2 subsequent work products that are coming out. They've gone through a comment or public consultation period. They have been finalized. They will be out for the public very shortly. One is specific to operationalizing the SBOM. So that there's a draft, obviously, that folks can see that's available on the web. The final IMDRF one will be published later on in the spring. And then, of course, most recently is the omnibus provision, which mandates SBOMs as part of the pre-market submission. I just will say before we go on to the next slide that this is also in very close alignment with an executive order that was published by the administration back in May 2021 around the requirement for SBOMs to exist across any kind of procurement by the federal government of devices in general. So this is not something new. This is something that the industry as a whole has been working on in terms of tooling and should continue to do so. Next slide. Legacy devices. And again, do not want to belabor the point here. I touched on it really at the beginning. It is, really probably one of the knottiest, the hardest issues for us within the healthcare ecosystem, the community to deal with, because of the investments that have been made over years by healthcare institutions in capital equipment and legacy and devices that were intended to remain in place, in use by hospitals and healthcare institutions for many years, and yet they did not have built into them or baked into them the considerations that are necessary from a cybersecurity perspective. So there have been multiple efforts underway in terms of addressing that. Two of them are partnership efforts. One is within the US, and that's through the Healthcare and Public Health Sector Coordinating Council. There is a document that's out right now, which is a legacy framework, which we're very excited to see out there, because again, it represents really bringing everybody around the table, device manufacturers, government, healthcare organizations, to solve what is a very difficult problem, at least to reduce the risk. And then going back to IMDRF, in addition to the SBOM guidance that we are, looking forward to seeing published, we also had been working on, through that working group, a separate piece on legacy devices, and that will also be published as final shortly. Next slide. All right, I'm going to have to spin through things pretty quickly here. So we're going to shift for a moment out of the medical device cybersecurity efforts, specifically to efforts that are happening within digital health center of excellence. And this speaks to another aspect of what was included in the omnibus appropriations, and that is the requirement on predetermined change control plans for devices. And I think everyone here likely understands why this is so crucial. The fact that we have devices today that provide extraordinary capabilities, and yet at the same time, there is a need for those devices to be able to be iterated or to learn and to be modified. So how does one do that in a manner that's least burdensome, while assuring the safety and effectiveness of the device without having to come in with new submissions all the time? So there, the appropriations language, the omnibus includes the predetermined change control plan. And this is very much aligned and consistent with what FDA has been proposing now for several years. If we go to the next slide, I think that will, yes. So the next slide speaks to how we have been over time from 2019 to the present, working together in a collaborative manner around the AI/ML enabled devices, and what our thinking is, initially putting out a discussion paper, holding or convening various workshops, subsequently issuing even an action plan around that. We've been, working around the aspect, which is very important to us in terms of transparency with AI/ML devices, including posting lists of currently marketed AI/ML devices. Did one back in 2021, followed up with one at the end of 2022, and you can expect to continue to see that happen. Next slide. The Digital Health Center of Excellence as well, just like the cybersecurity program that I outlined earlier, is heavily engaged in a lot of international harmonization efforts, as is depicted here, and will continue to be so as we go forward, in recognizing that there are not only different approaches by different regulators across the globe, but also mainly recognizing that firms, the companies are multinationals and, would be otherwise subject to different types of regulatory framework. So how can we align around that to the extent that it really streamlines for industry as well as therefore for the public what the appropriate expectations can be as we go forward. Next slide. So I just wanted to highlight also for folks, whether you have awareness or not around the existence of the Digital Health Policy Navigator as something that can serve as an additional resource for manufacturers, for designers, especially given the fact that the digital health program has really published many guidances over the years. And truly, it's hard to navigate through what is it that one needs to follow, what is the approach that one needs to take. And so this navigator is really a beautiful way to kind of step or guide you through what you need to be taking a look at and what considerations you would bring to the device that you're developing to determine, what you're therefore subject to. So let's turn to the next slide. And this provides really, again, a deeper dive. The way the navigator is set up is with a series of questions, step 1 through step 7, as you can see here. And it literally walks one through what you can expect from the FDA with regard to a device that you are developing. And of course, I also want to say, in addition to the fact that the Policy Navigator is out there as an open resource to utilize, certainly there's also always the opportunity to engage directly with the team from the Digital Health Center of Excellence, as well through the various Q-sub or pre-sub process when there are questions that arise. Next slide. Okay, and I think we are coming to, I think this is my last slide, and really it's just kind of that zoom out overview of what the commitments were through MDUFA 5 specific to digital health. And they fall into really these major buckets around kind of continuing to develop the expertise that we have been doing. We've been building a lot of bench strength within the digital health arena with the reviewers and the technical experts that have been recruited to the agency. And we will continue to strengthen those efforts. Obviously, we're also going to continue to participate in the different international harmonization efforts that presently exist. There's draft guidance around the content of pre-market submissions for device software functions that I know folks are waiting to see. And that guidance is in the process of being finalized and will, hopefully publish soon. And similarly, and I know this is going to come up as a result of the recent omnibus as well, we hope to be in the position to publish a draft guidance regarding the predetermined change control plan for digital health devices also soon. And then, in some ways, perhaps most importantly, our engagement with stakeholders, and that's across, that's the 360 around the entire ecosystem, especially as we at CDRH seek as a strategic priority from 2022 to 2025, the concept of advancing health equities and the importance that digital health technologies plays within that realm of being able to meet people where they are, meet patients where they are. Health care is being distributed. It's in the home, it's in the community, it's in rural areas, it's in underserved communities and areas. How do we enable that? And so the important aspect of that does reside within that future vision for digital health through the Center of Excellence. And a lot of that, again, primarily resides in terms of the engagement that we have with stakeholders. So with that, I know we are running a little short on time, but I'm going to turn it back to you, Amra, for some remaining Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne. That was really great. Much appreciated. Again, just about 5 minutes left. Would you be able to stay an additional few minutes if there are?
Unfortunately not, because I have an obligation. I'm sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
So just to summarize, Office of Strategic Partnerships and Technology Innovation. So it's about scientific, collaborative, and emerging technology-related activities. I would really encourage folks to log into the CDRH website to really understand what those other details are. We haven't even touched on pediatric medical device innovation, right? Or ethylene oxide emissions and the FDA challenge, innovation challenge around that. COVID response activities, all of that is within the realm of your responsibilities. But I'm just wondering, the omnibus, you talked a lot about that. If you could just briefly talk a little bit about that implementation timeframe of those provisions, and you mentioned the FDA's abilities to draft regulations. Are we to expect more guidances to come out as a result of that?
So there's a lot packed into that question in terms of the implementation. We are working on the implementation as we speak. On the cybersecurity side, there was a specific 90 days in terms of when that statute becomes self-effectuating. So we do know that manufacturers are awaiting information in terms of what does implementation look like. We're kind of coming close to that 90 days at the end of March. What I can tell you right now is, stay tuned. There will be information. We're not in a position right now to declare publicly what that means as far as how the statute will be implemented for cybersecurity. With regard to I'm blanking right now, they're predetermined change control plans, the PCCPs. So we are planning again on issuing draft guidance on that. I can't really give you a timeline on it, but that will be the first step with respect to that. We've already been, however, treating in terms of review of devices. We've been looking at them with that kind of frame of reference already, but in terms of providing a bit more of what manufacturers need to do, that would appear within that particular guidance. You asked about whether there would be additional regulations. And so, what I can tell you right now is while that's open-ended on the, for cybersecurity, we do feel that with respect to the guidance that was published initially as draft in April, that with the finalization of that guidance and its incorporation of the new requirements of the omnibus, that will likely get us to where we need to be. And so that's at least immediately in terms of being on the horizon there.
Excellent, great. You've answered one of my other questions regarding PCCPs and what manufacturers can do in order to prepare for that. And it sounds like there's a draft guidance coming out. So I think that's great news.
Right. The other thing I would say with regard to that is a good place to start is also a pre-sub meeting if you want to talk about the kinds of changes that are envisioned and the plan for ensuring that device remains safe and effective. And that, again, that's what we've been doing up through now. And so, in the absence of a guidance for people to kind of pick up and read, that's a place to start.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I know we can't talk too much about the comments, the feedback that you've received on the cybersecurity guidance, but we know that it's an A-list, right, guidance, so it's expected to come soon. Is there anything that you can share in terms of what's really, what's kind of exciting about it? Anything that's maybe that you are particularly excited to see come out within that?
Well, I think that this guidance, again, really further underscores all of the elements of what we have been saying need to be part of the pre-market submission, but with greater clarity, greater granularity. A lot of, again, that focus on SBOM as being important, the focus on threat modeling as being really important. So that transparency aspects, the trustworthiness aspects of a device, the fact that, we are seeking the evidence, also the material submitted by sponsors to demonstrate that devices can be patched and updated is really critical, because it comes back down to this idea of really trying to break that cycle of legacy technology being out there that that cannot be patched or updated, and then once it's out and in use, it's very, very difficult for healthcare organizations and providers to protect or to mitigate those risks and protect those devices.
Excellent, good. I do want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much. I think we need to pick up this conversation at a later time. There's a lot more, I'm sure, that we can unpack here, but this has been very insightful. Really appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schwartz. Thank you, Amra, for moderating the conversation. With that, everybody, we are concluding today's webinar. I would just like to say thank you one more time to all of our sponsors for today, Viva MedTech, Alira Health, Dwayne Morris, and Intertech. We appreciate all of your support. Please make sure you go to massmedic.com/events to find out all of the upcoming events we have going on. And everyone who registered for this webinar will receive the recording today and the slides as appropriate. So thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.